Chapter 91. A week later Kmita crossed the boundaries of electoral Prussia at Raygrad. It came to him easily enough. For before the departure of the full hetman he disappeared in the woods so secretly that Douglas felt sure that his party too had marched with the whole Tatar-Lithuanian division to Warsaw. And he left merely small garrisons in the castles for the defense of those parts. Douglas, with Radzievski and Radziwill, followed Gosiewski. Kmita heard of this before passing the boundary, and grieved greatly that he could not meet his mortal enemy eye to eye, and lest punishment might come to Boguslav from other hands, namely, from Wołodyjowski, who also had made a vow against him. Hence, not being able to wreak vengeance on the person of the traitor for the wrongs done the Commonwealth and himself, he wreaked it in terrible fashion on the lands of the Elector. That very night in which the Tartars had passed the boundary pillar, the heavens grew red from flames. An uproar was heard, with the weeping of people trampled by the foot of war. Whoso was able to beg for mercy in the Polish tongue was spared at command of the leader. But German settlements, colonies, villages, and hamlets were turned into a river of fire, and the terrified inhabitants went under the knife. And not so swiftly does oil spread over the sea when the sailor pours it to pacify the waves, as that shambole of Tartars and volunteers spread over quiet and hitherto safe regions. It seemed that every Tartar was able to double and treble himself, to be at the same time in a number of places, to burn, to slay. They spared not even grain in the field, nor trees in the gardens. Kmita had held his Tartars so long in the leash that at last, when he let them free like a flock of birds of prey, they grew almost wild in the midst of slaughter and destruction. One surpassed the other, and since they could not take captives, they swam from morning till evening in blood. Kmita himself, having in his heart no little fierceness, gave it full freedom, and though he did not steep his own hands in the blood of defenseless people, he looked with pleasure on the flow of blood. In his soul he was at rest, and conscience reproached him with nothing, for this was not Polish blood, and besides it was the blood of heretics. Therefore he judged that he was doing a work pleasing to God, and especially to the saints of the Lord. The Elector, a vassal, therefore a servant of the Commonwealth and living from its bounties, was the first to raise his sacrilegious hand against it. Therefore punishment was his due, and Kmita was purely an instrument of God's vengeance. For this reason, when in the evening he was repeating his litany in peace by the blaze of burning German settlements, and when the screams of the murdered interrupted the tally of his prayers, he began again from the beginning, so as not to burden his soul with the sin of inattention to the service of God. But he did not cherish in his heart savage feelings alone, for, besides piety, various other feelings moved it, connected by memory with distant years. Therefore those times came frequently to his mind when he attacked Hovanski with such glory, and his former comrades stood as if alive before his eyes, Kokosinski, the gigantic Kulvyets Hippocentaurus, the spotted Renitsky, with senatorial blood in his veins, Ulik, playing on the flageolet, Rekuts, on whom human blood was not weighing, and Zend, imitating birds and every kind of beast. They all, save perhaps Rekuts alone, were burning in hell. And behold, if they were living now, they might wallow in blood without bringing sin on their souls, and with profit to the Commonwealth. Here Pan Andrei sighed at the thought of how destructive a thing license is, since in the morning of youth it stops the road for the ages of ages to beautiful deeds. But he sighed more than all for Olenka. The deeper he entered the Prussian country, the more fiercely did the wounds of his heart burn him, as if those fires which he kindled roused at the same time his old love. Almost every day then he said in his heart to the maiden, "Dearest dove, you may have forgotten me, or if you remember, disgust fills your heart. But I, at a distance or near, in the night or the daytime, in labor for the country and toils, am thinking ever of you, and my soul flies to you over pine woods and waters, like a tired bird, to drop down at your feet. Only to the country and to you would I give all my blood, but woe is me, if in your heart you proclaim me an outlaw forever." Thus meditating, he went ever farther to the north along the boundary belt. He burned and slew, sparing no one. Sadness throttled him terribly. He would like to be in Trilogy on the morrow. But the road was still long and difficult, for at last they began to ring all the bells in the province of Prussia. Everyone living seized arms to resist the dreadful destroyers. Garrisons were brought in from towns the remotest, regiments were formed of even village youths, and soon they were able to place 20 men against every Tartar. Kmita rushed at these commands like a thunderbolt, beat them, hanged men, escaped, hid, and again sailed out on a wave of fire, but still he could not advance so swiftly as at first. More than once it was necessary to attack in Tartar fashion, and hide for whole weeks in thickets or reeds at the banks of a lake. The inhabitants rushed forth more and more numerously, as if against a wolf. And he bit too like a wolf, with one snap of his jaws he gave death, and not only defended himself, but did not desist from attack. Loving genuine work, he did not leave a given district, in spite of pursuit, until he had annihilated it for miles around with fire and sword. His name reached, it is unknown by what means, the mouths of the people, and bearing terror and fright, thundered on to the shores of the Baltic. Babinnik might, it is true, return within the boundaries of the Commonwealth, and in spite of Swedish detachments, move quickly to Trilogy. But he did not wish to do so, for he desired to serve not only himself but the country. Now came news which gave courage for defense and revenge to the people in Prussia, but pierced the heart of Babinnik with savage sorrow. News came like a thunderclap of a great battle at Warsaw, which the King of Poland had lost. Carl Gustav and the Elector have beaten all the troops of Yen Casimir, people repeated to one and another with delight throughout Prussia. Warsaw is recaptured. This is the greatest victory of the war, and now comes the end of the Commonwealth. All men whom the Tartars seized and put on the coals to obtain information, repeated the same. There was also exaggerated news, as is common in time of war and uncertainty. According to this news the Poles were cut to pieces, the hetmans had fallen, and Yen Casimir was captured. Was all at an end, then? Was that rising and triumphing Commonwealth naught but an empty illusion? So much power, so many troops, so many great men and famous warriors. The hetmans, the king, Charniecki with his invincible division, the marshal of the kingdom, other lords with their attendants, had all perished, had all rolled away like smoke? And are there no other defenders of this hapless country, save detached parties of insurgents who certainly at news of the disaster will pass away like a fog? Kmita tore the hair from his head and wrung his hands. He seized the wet earth, pressed palms full of it to his burning head. I shall fall too, said he, but first this land will swim in blood. And he began to fight like a man in despair. He did not hide longer, he did not attack in the forest and reeds, he sought death. He rushed like a madman on forces 3 times greater than his own, and cut them to pieces with sabers and hoofs. In his Tartars all traces of human feeling died out, and they were turned into a herd of wild beasts. A predatory people, but not overmuch fitted for fighting in the open field, without losing their genius for surprises and ambush, they, by continual exercise, by continual conflict, had trained themselves so that breast to breast they could hold the field against the first cavalry, and scatter quadrangles even of the Swedish Guard. In their struggles with the armed mob of Prussia, 100 of those Tartars scattered with ease 2 and even 300 sturdy men armed with spears and muskets. Kmita weaned them from weighting themselves with plunder. They took only money and gold, which they sewed up in their saddles, so that when one of them fell the survivors fought with rage for his horse and his saddle. Growing rich in this manner, they lost none of their swiftness, well nigh superhuman. Recognizing that under no leader on earth could they find such rich harvests, they grew attached to Babinnik, as hounds to the hunter. And with real Mohammedan honesty placed after battle in the hands of Soroka and the Kyamliks the lion's share of the plunder which belonged to the Bagadir. Allah, said Akba Ulan, few of them will see Bagsarai, but all who go back will be Mirzas. Babinnik, who from of old knew how to live upon war, collected great riches. But death, which he sought more than gold, he found not. A month passed again in battles and labors surpassing belief. The Tartar horses, though fed with barley and Prussian wheat, needed absolutely even a couple of days' rest. Therefore the young colonel, wishing also to gain news and fill the gaps in his ranks with fresh volunteers, withdrew, near Dospota, to the Commonwealth. News soon came, and so joyful that Kmita almost lost his wits. It turned out to be true that the equally valiant and unfortunate Jan Kazimir had lost a great 3 days' battle at Warsaw, but for what reason? The general militia in an immense majority had gone home, and the part which remained did not fight with such spirit as at the taking of Warsaw, and on the 3rd day of the battle a panic set in. But for the first 2 days the victory was inclining to the side of Poland. The regular troops, not in sudden partisan warfare, but in a great battle with the most highly trained soldiers of Europe, exhibited such skill and endurance that amazement seized the Swedish and Brandenburg generals themselves. Jan Kazimir had won immortal glory. It was said that he had shown himself a leader equal to Carl Gustaf, and that if all his commands had been carried out the enemy would have lost the general battle, and the war would have been ended. Kmita received these tidings from eyewitnesses, for he had stumbled upon nobles who, serving in the general militia, had taken part in the battle. One of them told him of the brilliant attack of the Hussars, during which Karl himself, who, despite the entreaties of his generals, would not withdraw, came near perishing. All showed the falsehood of the report that the army had been routed or the hetmans had fallen. On the contrary, the whole force, except the general militia, remained intact, and withdrew in good order along the country. From the bridge of Warsaw which was giving way cannon had fallen. But they were pulled through the Vistula in a breath. The army swore by everything that under such a leader as Jan Kazimir they would, in the coming battle, conquer Carl Gustaf, the Elector, and whomsoever it might be necessary to conquer. As to the recent battle, it was only a trial, though unfavorable, but full of solace for the future. Kmita was at a loss to know how the first news could have been so terrible. They explained to him that Carl Gustaf had sent out exaggerated reports purposely. In fact, he did not know well what to do. The Swedish officers whom Pan Andrei seized a week later confirmed this opinion. He learned also from them that beyond others the Elector lived in fear, and was thinking more and more of his own safety. For a multitude of his men had fallen at Warsaw, and disease had seized those remaining so terribly that it was destroying them more quickly than battles. At the same time the men of Great Poland, eager to make good justy in all wrongs, had attacked the monarchy of Brandenburg itself, burning and slaying, leaving nothing behind them but land and water. According to the officers, the hour was near in which the Elector would abandon the Swedes, and join the more powerful. It is needful to touch him with fire somewhat, thought Kmita, so that he may do this the more quickly. And since his horses were rested already, and he had made good the losses among his men, he passed the boundary again at Dospota, and rushed on the German settlements like a spirit of destruction. Various parties followed his example. He found a weaker defense, hence he accomplished more. News came ever more joyful, more gladdening, so that it was difficult to believe it. First of all, it was said that Carl Gustaf, who, after the Warsaw battle, had pushed on to Radom, was retreating at breakneck speed to Royal Prussia. What had happened? Why was he retreating? There was no answer to this for a time, till at last the name of Charniecki thundered again through the Commonwealth. He was victorious at Lipetsk, victorious at Szczemeszno. At Rava itself he had cut to pieces the rear guard of the retreating Karl. Then, learning that 2,000 cavalry were returning from Krakow, he attacked that body, and did not let one man escape to announce the defeat. Colonel Fergel, brother of the general, 13 captains, and 24 lieutenants went into captivity. Others gave the numbers as twice greater. Some insisted in their enthusiasm that Jan Kazimir had not suffered a defeat, but had won a victory at Warsaw, and that his march along the country was only a stratagem for the destruction of the enemy. Kmita himself began to think the same, for being a soldier from youthful years, he understood war, but had never heard of a victory after which the victor was in a worse condition than before. The Swedes were evidently in a worse condition, and just after the battle at Warsaw. Pan Andrei called to mind at that moment the words of Zagloba, when at their last meeting he said that victories would not improve the Swedish cause, but that one defeat might destroy it. That is a chancellor's head, pondered Kmita, which reads in the future as in a book. Here he remembered the further predictions, how he, Kmita or Babinnik, would go to Torogi, find his Olenka, persuade her, marry her, and have descendants to the glory of the Commonwealth. When he remembered this, fire entered his veins. He wished not to lose a moment, but to leave Prussians in slaughter for a time, and fly to Torogi. On the eve of his starting there came to him a noble of Leuda, of Wołodyjowski's squadron, with a letter from the little knight. "We are going with Sapieha and Prince Michael Radziwill against Boguslav and Waldeck," wrote Pan Michael. "Join us, since a field for just vengeance will be found, and it is proper to pay the Prussians for harm done the Commonwealth." Pan Andrei could not believe his own eyes, and for some time he suspected the noble of being sent by some Prussian or Swedish commandant of purpose to lead him with the Shambul into ambush. Had Gosiewski come a second time to Prussia? It was impossible not to believe. The handwriting was Wołodyjowski's, the arms Wołodyjowski's, and Pan Andrei remembered the noble too. Then he inquired where Gosiewski was, and to what point he intended to go. The noble was rather dull. It was not for him to know whither the hetman was marching. He knew only that he was 2 days distant, and that the Leuda squadron was with him. Charniecki had borrowed it for a while, but had sent it back long ago, and now it was marching under lead of the hetman. "They say," concluded the noble, "that we must go to Prussia, and the soldiers are greatly delighted. But our work is to obey and to strike." Kmita, when he had heard the narrative, did not hesitate long. He turned his Shambul, went with forced marches to the hetman, and after 2 days fell late at night into the arms of Wołodyjowski, who, pressing him, said at once, "Count Waldeck and Prince Boguslav are in Prostki, making entrenchments to secure themselves with a fortified camp. We shall march on them." "Today?" asked Kmita. "Tomorrow before daybreak, that is, in 2 or 3 hours." Here they embraced each other again. "Something tells me that God will give him into our hands," exclaimed Kmita, with emotion. "And I think so too. I have made a vow to fast till death on the day in which I meet him." "The protection of God will not fail you," said Wołodyjowski. "I shall not be envious, either, if this lot falls to you, for your wrong is greater. Jędrek, let me look at you. You have grown perfectly black from the weather, but you have acquitted yourself. The whole division looks with the greatest esteem on your labor. Nothing behind you but ruins and corpses. You are a born soldier, and it would go hard with Zagloba himself, were he here, to invent in self-praise deeds better than those you have done. But where is Zagloba? He remained with Sapieha. For he fell into weeping and despair after Kowalski. Then has Kowalski fallen?" Wołodyjowski pressed his lips. "Do you know who killed him?" "Whence should I know?" "Tell me." "Prince Boguslav." Kmita turned in his place, as if thrust with a point, and began to draw in air with a hiss. At last he gritted his teeth, and casting himself on the bench, rested his head on his palms in silence. Wołodyjowski clapped his hands, and ordered the attendant to bring drink. Then he sat near Kmita, filled a cup for him, and began. "Ron Kowalski died such a cavalier's death that God grant any man of us to die no worse. It is enough to inform you that Karl Gustav himself after the battle celebrated his funeral, and a whole regiment of the guards fired a salute over his coffin." "If only not at those hands, at those hellish hands," exclaimed Kmita. "Yes, at the hands of Boguslav. We know that from hussars who with their own eyes saw the sad end. Were you not there then? In battle places are not chosen, but a man stands where he is ordered. If I had been there, either I should not be here now, or Boguslav would not be making trenches at Prostki. Tell me how it all happened. It will only increase the anger." Pan Michael drank, wiped his yellow mustaches, and began. Of a certainty you are not lacking in narratives of the Warsaw battle, for everyone is speaking of it. Therefore I shall not dwell on it too long. Our gracious Lord, God give him health and long years. For under another king the country would have perished amid disasters, has shown himself a famous leader. Had there been such obedience as there was command, had we been worthy of the king, the chroniclers would have to describe a new Polish victory at Warsaw equal to those at Grunwald and Berestechko. Speaking briefly, on the first day we beat the Swedes, on the second, fortune inclined now to one, now to the other, but still we were uppermost. At that time the Lithuanian Hussars, in which Kowalski served under Prince Polyabinski, a great soldier, went to the attack. When they were passing I saw them as I see you this moment, for I was with the Luda men on a height near the entrenchments. They were 1,200 strong, men and horses such as the world had not seen. They passed 20 rods distant from our flank, and I tell you that the earth trembled under them. We saw the Brandenburg infantry planting their pikes in the ground in a hurry, to meet the first onrush. Then began firing from muskets, till the smoke covered them entirely. We looked. The hussars had given rein to their horses. Oh God, what a sweep! They fell into the smoke, disappeared. My soldiers began to shout, "They will break them, they will break them." For a while the hussars were invisible, then something thundered, and there was a sound as if in 1,000 forges men were beating anvils with hammers. We look. Jesus! Mary! The elector's men are lying like stones on a street, like wheat through which a tempest has passed, and the hussars far away beyond, their streamers glittering. They are bearing down on the Swedes. They struck cavalry, the cavalry were down like a pavement. They struck a second regiment, they left that like a pavement. There was a roar, cannon were thundering. We saw them when the wind bore the smoke aside. They were smashing Swedish infantry. Everything was fleeing, rolling, opening, they went on as if over a highway. They had passed almost through the whole army, when they struck a regiment of the Horse Guard, in which was Karl Gustav himself, and like a whirlwind they scattered the Horse Guard. Here Pan Michael stopped, for Kmita had closed his eyes with his fists and was exclaiming, "O Mother of God! To see such a thing once and then die! Such an attack my eyes will never see again," continued the little knight. We too were commanded to spring forward. I saw no more, but what I tell I heard from the mouth of a Swedish officer who was at the side of Karl and saw with his own eyes the end. That Fergel who fell into our hands afterward at Rava, rushed up to Karl. "O king," cried he, "save Sweden. Save yourself. Aside, aside. Nothing can stop them." But Karl answered, "No use to yield. We must meet them or perish." Other generals rush up, implore, entreat, in vain. The king moved forward, they strike. The Swedes are broken more quickly than you can count 10. One fell, another was trampled, others were scattered like peas. The king defended himself single-handed. Kowalski rode up and knew Karl Gustav, for he had seen him twice before. A horseman shielded the king, but those who were present said that lightning does not kill more quickly than Kowalski cut him in two. Then the king rushed at Pan Row. Wołodyjowski again interrupted his narrative and breathed deeply, but Kmita cried at once, "Oh, finish, or the soul will go out of me." They rushed at each other so that the breasts of the horses struck. They raged. "I look," said the officer, "the king with his horse is on the ground." He freed himself, touched the trigger of his pistol, missed. The king's hat had fallen. Rowe then made for the head of Karl Gustav, had his sword raised. The Swedes were weak from terror, for there was no time to save Karl, when Boguslav rose as if from under the earth, fired into the very ear of Kowalski, broke his head and his helmet. "Oh my God! He had not time to bring down the sword," screamed Pan Andrei, tearing his hair. "God did not grant him that grace," said Pan Michael. Zagloba and I talked of what had happened. The man had served with the Radzivills from years of youth, he considered them his masters, and at sight of Radzivill it must be that he was confused. Perhaps the thought had never come to his head to raise a hand on Radzivill. It happens that way. Well, he paid with his life. Zagloba is a wonderful man, for he is not Ro's uncle at all, and not his relative, still another man would not have been in such despair for a son. And, to tell the truth, there was no reason, for one might envy Kowalski such a glorious death. A noble and a soldier is born to give his life, if not on the present day then on the morrow. Men will write of Kowalski, and posterity will celebrate his name. Pan Michael was silent. After a while he made the sign of the cross and said, "Eternal rest give him, O Lord, and may light shine on him forever." "For the ages of ages," said Kmita. Both whispered prayers for a certain time, maybe asking for themselves a similar death, if only not at the hands of Prince Boguslav. At last Pan Michael said, "Father Piakarski assured us that Ro went straight to heaven." "Of course he did, and our prayers are not needed for him. Prayers are always needed. For they are inscribed to the credit of others, and maybe to our own. My hope is in the mercy of God," said Kmita, sighing. "I trust that for what I have done in Prussia, even a couple of years will be taken from me in purgatory. Everything there is reckoned. What a man works out here with his saber, the heavenly secretary records." "I too served with Radzivill," said Kmita, "but I shall not be confused at sight of Boguslav. My God, my God! Prostki is not far away. Remember, O Lord, that he is thy enemy too, for he is a heretic who more than once has blasphemed thy true faith. And is an enemy of the country," added Pan Michael. "We have hope that his end is approaching." Zagloba, speaking in grief and in tears and as if inspired, foretold the same after that attack of the Hussars. He cursed Boguslav so that the hair stood on the head of every man listening. Prince Michael Radzivill, who is marching with us against him, saw also in a dream 2 golden trumpets, which the Radzivills have on their shield, gnawed by a bear, and he said at once next day, "Misfortune will meet me or some other Radzivill." "By a bear?" asked Kmita, growing pale. "By a bear." Pan Andrei's face became clear as if a gleam of the morning dawn had fallen on it. He raised his eyes, stretched his hands toward heaven and said with a solemn voice, "I have a bear on my shield. Praise to thee, O Lord on high. Praise to thee, most holy Mother. O Lord, O Lord. I am not worthy of this grace." When he heard this Pan Michael was greatly moved, for he recognized at once that that was an omen from heaven. "Jędrek!" cried he, "to make sure, press the feet of Christ before the battle, and I will implore him against Sienkiewicz." "Prostki! Prostki!" repeated Kmita, as in a fever. "When do we move?" "Before day, and soon it will begin to dawn." Kmita approached the broken window of the cottage and cried, "The stars are paling already. Ave, Maria." Then came the distant crowing of a cock, and with it low trumpeting. A few Our Fathers later, movement began in the whole village. The clatter of steel was heard, and the snorting of horses. Dark masses of cavalry assembled on the highway. The air began to be filled with light. A pale gleam was silvering the points of the spears, twinkling on the naked sabers, bringing out of the shade mustached threatening faces, helmets, kolpaks, Tartar sheepskin caps, fur cloaks, quivers. At last the advance with Kmita in the vanguard was moving toward Prostki. The troops stretched in a long line over the road, and marched quickly. The horses in the first ranks fell to snorting greatly, after them others, as a good portent for the soldiers. White mists hid the meadows yet, and the fields. Round about was silence. Only landrails were playing in the grass, wet with dew. Chapter 92. September 6, the Polish troops arrived at Vansosh and disposed themselves for rest, so that before battle horses and men might gain strength. Pan Gosiewski, the hetman, decided to halt there 4 or 5 days, but events interfered with his reckoning. Babinik, as a man knowing the boundary well, was sent on a reconnaissance. He was given 2 light Lithuanian squadrons and a fresh chambul of Tartars, for his own Tartars were overmuch wearied. Gosiewski enjoined on him earnestly, before starting, to obtain an informant and not to return empty-handed. But Babinik merely laughed, thinking to himself that he needed no urging, and that he would bring prisoners, even if he had to find them in the entrenchments of Prostki. In fact, he returned in 48 hours, bringing a number of Prussians and Swedes, and among them an officer of note, von Rossel, captain in a Prussian regiment under Boguslav. The party was received in the camp with great applause. There was no need of torturing the captain, for Babinik had already done that on the road by putting the sword point to his throat. From his statements it transpired that not only the Prussian regiments of Count Waldeck were in Prostki, but also 6 Swedish regiments under command of Major General Israel. Of these, 4 were of cavalry under Peters, Fridtjohnsson, Tauben, and Ammerstein, with 2 of infantry under the brothers Engel. Of Prussian regiments, which were very well equipped, besides that of Count Waldeck himself, there were 4, those of the Prince of Wismar, Brunsel, Konneberg. General Walrat, with 4 squadrons of Boguslav's command, 2 being of Prussian nobles, and 2 of his own men. Supreme command was held by Count Waldeck. In reality, however, he obeyed in everything Prince Boguslav, to whose influence the Swedish General Israel also yielded. But the most important intelligence given by Rossel was this, that 2,000 chosen infantry of Pomerania were hastening from Elko to reinforce Prostki. But Count Waldeck, fearing lest these men might be taken by the horde, wished to leave the fortified camp, join the Pomeranians, and then make entrenchments a second time. Boguslav, according to Rossel, was so far rather strongly opposed to leaving Prostki, and only during the last days began to incline toward this action. Gosiewski on hearing this news was greatly rejoiced, for he was certain that victory would not miss him. The enemy might defend themselves for a long time in the entrenchments, but neither the Swedish or the Prussian cavalry could resist the Poles in the open field. Prince Boguslav seemed to understand this fact as well as Gosiewski, and for this special reason he did not much approve Waldeck's plans. But he was too vain not to yield before even the reproach of excessive caution. Besides, he was not distinguished for patience. It might be reckoned almost with certainty that he would grow weary of waiting in trenches, and would seek fame and victory in the open field. Gosiewski had simply to hasten his advance on the enemy at the moment when they were leaving the entrenchments. So thought he, so thought other colonels, such as Hassan Bey, who led the horde. Voinilovich, who led the king's regiment, Korsak, a light horse colonel, Wołodyjowski, Kotvich, and Babinik. All agreed on one point, that it was necessary to give up further rest, and march in the night, that is, in a few hours. Meanwhile Korsak sent his banneret, Byagansky, to Prostki to inform the advancing army every hour of what was taking place in the camp. Wołodyjowski and Babinik took Rossel to their quarters to learn something more of Boguslav. The captain was greatly alarmed at first, for he felt still at his throat Kmita's saber point, but wine soon loosened his tongue. Since he had served once in the Commonwealth in a foreign command, he had learned Polish, therefore he was able to answer the questions of the little knight, who did not know German. "Have you been long in the service of Prince Boguslav?" asked Wołodyjowski. "I do not serve in his army," answered Rossel, "but in the Elector's regiment, which was put under his command." "Then do you know Pan Sakovich?" "I have seen him in Königsberg." "Is he with the prince?" "He is not, he remained in Torogi." Wołodyjowski sighed and moved his mustaches. "I have no luck, as usual," said he. "Be not grieved, Michael," said Babinik. "You will find him, if not, I shall." Then he turned to Rossel. "You are an old soldier. You have seen both armies, and you know our cavalry of old. What do you think, on whose side will be victory? If they meet you outside the trenches, on yours. But you cannot take the trenches without infantry and cannon, especially since everything is done there with Radzivill's head. Then do you consider him such a great leader? Not only is that my opinion, but it is the general opinion in both armies. They say that at Warsaw the most serene king of Sweden followed his advice, and therefore won a great battle. The prince, as a Pole, has a better knowledge of your method of warfare and can manage more quickly. I saw myself that the king of Sweden after the third day of battle embraced him in front of the army and kissed him. It is true that he owed his life to him. For had it not been for the shot of the prince, but it is a terror to think of it. He is besides an incomparable knight, whom no man can meet with any weapon. Said Wołodyjowski, maybe there is such a man. When he had said this, his mustaches trembled threateningly. Rossel looked at him, and grew suddenly red. For a time it seemed that either he would burst a blood vessel or break into laughter, but at last he remembered that he was in captivity, and controlled himself quickly. But Kmita with his steel eyes looked at him steadily and said, "That will be shown tomorrow." "But is Boguslav in good health?" asked Wołodyjowski. For the fever shook him a long time, and must have weakened him. "He is, and has been this long time, as healthy as a fish, and takes no medicine." The doctor at first wanted to give him many preservatives, but immediately after the first came a paroxysm. Prince Boguslav gave orders to toss that doctor up from sheets. And that helped him, for the doctor himself got a fever from fright. "To toss him up from sheets?" asked Wołodyjowski. "I saw it myself," answered Rossel. 2 sheets were placed one above the other, and the doctor put in the center of them. 4 strong soldiers took the sheets by the corners, and threw up the poor doctor. I tell you, gentlemen, that he went nearly 10 ells into the air, and he had hardly come down when they hurled him up again. General Israel, Count Waldeck, and the prince were holding their sides from laughter. Many of the officers too were looking at the spectacle, till the doctor fainted. Then the prince was free of his fever, as if some hand had removed it. Though Pan Michael and Babinik hated Boguslav, still they could not restrain themselves from laughter when they heard of this joke. Babinik struck his knees and cried, "Ah, the scoundrel! How he helped himself!" "I must tell Zagloba of this medicine," said Pan Michael. "It cured him of the fever," said Rossel. "But what is that, when the prince does not restrain sufficiently the impulses of his blood, and therefore will not live to ripe age?" "I think so too," muttered Babinik. "Such as he do not live long." "Does he give way to himself in the camp?" asked Pan Michael. "Of course," answered Rossel. Count Waldeck laughed, saying that his princely grace takes with him waiting maids. "I saw myself 2 handsome maidens, his attendants told me that they were there to iron his lace, but God knows." Babinik, when he heard this, grew red and pale, then he sprang up, and seizing Rossel by the arm began to shake him violently. "Are they Poles or Germans?" "Not Poles," said the terrified Rossel. "One is a Prussian noblewoman, the other is a Swede, who formerly served the wife of General Israel." Babinik looked at Pan Michael and drew a deep breath. The little knight was relieved too, and began to move his mustaches. "Gentlemen, permit me to rest," said Rossel. "I am dreadfully tired, for the Tartar led me 10 miles with a lariat." Kmita clapped his hands for Soroka, and committed the prisoner to him, then he turned with quick step to Pan Michael. "Enough of this," said he. "I would rather perish 100 times than live in this ceaseless alarm and uncertainty. When Rossel mentioned those women just now, I thought that someone was going at my temple with a club." "It is time to finish," said Wołodyjowski, shaking his saber. At that moment trumpets sounded at the hetman's quarters. Soon trumpets answered in all the Lithuanian squadrons, and pipes in the chambuls. The troops began to assemble, and an hour later were on the march. Before they had gone 5 miles a messenger hurried up from Byagansky of Korsak's squadron, with intelligence for the hetman that a number of troopers had been seized from a considerable body occupied in collecting on that side of the river all the wagons and horses of the peasants. Interrogated on the spot, they acknowledged that the tabor of the whole army was to leave Prostki about 8 o'clock in the morning, and that commands were issued already. "Let us praise God and urge on our horses," said Gosiewski. "Before evening that army will be no longer in existence." He sent the horde neck and head to push with utmost endeavor between Waldeck's troops and the Pomeranian infantry hastening to aid them. After the horde went Lithuanians. Being mainly of the light squadrons, they came right after the horde. Kmita was in the front rank of the Tartars, and urged on his men till the horses were steaming. On the road he bowed down on the saddle, struck his forehead on the neck of his horse, and prayed with all the powers of his soul. "Grant me, O Christ, to take vengeance, not for my own wrongs, but for the insults wrought on the country. I am a sinner, I am not worthy of thy grace, but have mercy on me. Permit me to shed the blood of heretics, and for thy praise I will fast and scourge myself every week on this day till the end of my life." Then to the Most Holy Lady of Chenstohova, whom he had served with his blood, and to his own patron besides, did he commit himself. And strong with such protection, he felt straightway that an immense hope was entering his soul. That an uncommon power was penetrating his limbs, a power before which everything must fall in the dust. It seemed to him that wings were growing from his shoulders, joy embraced him like a whirlwind, and he flew in front of his Tartars, so that sparks were scattered from under the hoofs of his steed. Thousands of wild warriors bent forward to the necks of their ponies, and shot along after him. A river of pointed caps rose and fell with the rush of the horses. Bows rattled behind the men's shoulders, in front went the sound from the tramp of iron hoofs, from behind flew the roar of the oncoming squadrons, like the deep roar of a great swollen river. And thus they flew on in the rich starry night which covered the roads and the fields. They were like a mighty flock of ravening birds which had smelled blood in the distance. Fields, oak groves, meadows, sped past, till at last the waning moon became pale and inclined in the west. Then they reined in their beasts, and halted for final refreshment. It was not farther now than 2 miles from Prostki. The Tartars fed their horses with barley from their hands, so that the beasts might gain strength before battle. But Kmita sat on a fresh pony and rode farther to look at the camp of the enemy. After half an hour's ride he found in the willows the light horse party which Corsic had sent to reconnoiter. "Well," asked Kmita, "what is to be heard?" "They are not sleeping, they are bustling like bees in a hive," answered the banneret. "They would have started already, but have not wagons sufficient." "Can the camp be seen from some point near at hand?" "It can from that height which is covered with bushes. The camp lies over there in the valley of the river." "Does your grace wish to see it?" "Lead on." The banneret put spurs to his horse, and they rode to the height. Day was already in the sky, and the air was filled with a golden light. But along the river on the opposite low bank there lay still a dense fog. Hidden in the bushes, they looked at that fog growing thinner and thinner. At last about 2 furlongs distant a square earthwork was laid bare. Kmita's glance was fixed on it with eagerness. But at the first moment he saw only the misty outlines of tents and wagons standing in the center along the entrenchments. The blaze of fires was not visible. He saw only smoke rising in lofty curls to the sky in sign of fine weather. But as the fog vanished Pan Andrei could distinguish through his fieldglass blue Swedish and yellow Prussian banners planted on the entrenchments, then masses of soldiers, cannon, and horses. Around there was silence, broken only by the rustle of bushes moved by the breeze, and the glad morning twitter of birds, but from the camp came a deep sound. Evidently no one was sleeping, and they were preparing to march, for in the center of the entrenchment was an unusual stir. Whole regiments were moving from place to place. Some went out in front of the entrenchments, around the wagons there was a tremendous bustle. Cannon also were drawn from the trenches. "It cannot be but they are preparing to march," said Kmita. All the prisoners said, "They wish to make a junction with the infantry, and besides they do not think that the hetman can come up before evening. And even if he were to come up, they prefer a battle in the open field to yielding that infantry to the knife." About 2 hours will pass before they move, and at the end of 2 hours the hetman will be here. Praise be to God, said the banneret. Send to tell our men not to feed too long. According to order. But have they not sent away parties to this side of the river? To this side they have not sent one. But they have sent some to their infantry, marching from Elko. It is well, said Kmita. And he descended the height, and commanding the party to hide longer in the rushes, moved back himself with all the breath in his horse to the squadron. Gosiewski was just mounting when Babinnik arrived. The young knight told quickly what he had seen and what the position was. The hetman listened with great satisfaction, and urged forward the squadrons without delay. Babinnik's party went in advance, after it the Lithuanian squadrons. Then that of Voinilovich, that of Luda, the hetman's own, and others. The horde remained behind. For Hassan Bey begged for that with insistence, fearing that his men might not withstand the first onset of the heavy cavalry. He had also another reckoning. He wished, when the Lithuanians struck the enemy's front, to seize the camp with his Tartars. In the camp he expected to find very rich plunder. The hetman permitted this, thinking justly that the Tartars would strike weakly on the cavalry, but would fall like madmen on the tabor and might raise a panic. Especially since the Prussian horses were less accustomed to their terrible howling. In 2 hours, as Kmita had predicted, they halted in front of that elevation from which the scouting party had looked into the entrenchments, and which now concealed the march of all the troops. The banneret, seeing the troops approaching, sprang forward like lightning with intelligence that the enemy, having withdrawn the pickets from this side of the river, had already moved. And that the rear of the tabor was just leaving the entrenchments. When he heard this, Gosiewski drew his baton from the holsters of the saddle, and said, "They cannot return now, for the wagons block the way. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. There is no reason to hide longer." He beckoned to the bunchuk bearer, and he, raising the horsetail standard aloft, waved it on every side. At this sign all the horsetail standards began to wave, trumpets thundered, Tartar pipes squeaked, 6,000 sabers were gleaming in the air, and 6,000 throats shouted, "Jesus! Mary! Allah, Allah!" Then squadron after squadron rose in a trot from behind the height. In Waldeck's camp they had not expected guests so soon, for a feverish movement set in. The drums rattled uninterruptedly, the regiments turned with front to the river. It was possible to see with the naked eye generals and colonels flying between the regiments. They hurried to the center with the cannon, so as to bring them forward to the river. After a while both armies were not farther than 1,000 yards from each other. They were divided only by a broad meadow, in the center of which a river flowed. Another moment, and the first streak of white smoke bloomed out from the Prussian side toward the Poles. The battle had begun. The hetman himself sprang toward Kmita's troops. "Advance, Babinnik! Advance in God's name against that line!" And he pointed with his baton to the gleaming regiment of cavalry. "Follow me," commanded Pan Andrei. And pressing his horse with spurs, he moved at a gallop toward the river. More swiftly than an arrow from a bow did they shoot forward. The horses had gained their highest speed, and were running with ears dropped back, and bodies stretched out like the bodies of hounds. The riders bent forward to the manes of their horses, and howling, lashed onward the beasts, which now did not seem to touch earth. They rushed with that impetus into the river. The water did not restrain them, for they came upon a broad ford, level and sandy. They reached the other bank, and sprang on in a body. Seeing this, the regiment of armored cavalry moved toward them, first at a walk, then at a trot, and did not go faster, but when Kmita's front had come within 20 yards, the command, "Fire!" was heard, and 1,000 arms with pistols were stretched forward. A line of smoke ran from one end of the rank to the other, then the two bodies struck each other with a crash. The horses reared at the first blow, over the heads of the combatants glittered sabers through the whole length of the line. A serpent as it were of lightning flew from end to end. The ominous clang of blades against helmets and breastplates was heard to the other side of the river. It seemed as if hammers were ringing in forges on plates of steel. The line bent in one moment into a crescent, for since the center of the German cavalry yielded, pushed back by the first onset, the wings, against which less force was directed, kept their places. But the armored soldiers did not let the center be broken, and a terrible slaughter began. On one side enormous men covered with armor resisted with the whole weight of horses. On the other the grey host of Tartars pushed with the force of accumulated impetus, cutting and thrusting with an inconceivable rapidity which only uncommon activity in ceaseless practice can give. As when a host of woodcutters rush at a forest of pine trees there is heard only the sound of axes, and time after time some lofty tree falls to the ground with a fearful crash. So every moment someone of the cavalry bent his shining head and rolled under his horse. The sabers of Kmita's men glittered in their eyes, cut around their faces, eyes, hands. In vain does a sturdy soldier raise his heavy sword. Before he can bring it down, he feels a cold point entering his body. Then the sword drops from his hand, and he falls with bloody face on the neck of his horse. When a swarm of wasps attack in an orchard him who is shaking down fruit, vainly does the man ward them off with his hands, try to free himself, dodge aside. They reach his face skillfully, reach his neck, and each one drives into him a sharp sting. So did Kmita's raging men, trained in so many battles, rush forward, cut, thrust, spread terror and death more and more stubbornly. Surpassing their opponents as much as a skillful craftsman surpasses the sturdiest apprentice who is wanting in practice. Therefore the German cavalry began to fall more quickly, and the center, against which Kmita himself was fighting, became so thin that it might break at any moment. Commands of officers, summoning soldiers to shattered places, were lost in the uproar and wild shouting. The line did not come together quickly enough, and Kmita pressed with increasing power. Wearing chainmail, a gift from Steppe, he fought as a simple soldier, having with him the young Kyemliches and Soroka. Their office was to guard their master. And every moment someone of them turned to the right or the left, giving a terrible blow. But Kmita rushed on his chestnut horse to the thickest of the fight, and having all the secrets of Pan Michael, and gigantic strength, he quenched men's lives quickly. Sometimes he struck with his whole saber, sometimes he barely reached with the point. Sometimes he described a small circle merely, but quick as lightning, and a horseman flew head downward under his beast, as if a thunderbolt had hurled him from the saddle. Others withdrew before the terrible man. At last Pan Andrei slashed the standard-bearer in the temple. He gave forth a sound like that which a cock gives if his throat is cut, and dropped the standard from his hand. At that moment the center broke, and the disordered wings forming two chaotic bodies fled swiftly to the farther lines of the Prussian army. Kmita looked through the broken center into the depth of the field, and saw at once a regiment of red dragoons flying like wind to the aid of the broken cavalry. That is nothing, thought he. Wołodyjowski will cross the ford in a moment to aid me. At that instant was heard the thunder of cannon so loud that the earth trembled in its foundations. Musketry rattled from the entrenchment to those ranks of the Poles who had pushed forward most. The whole field was covered with smoke, and in that smoke Kmita's volunteers and Tartars closed with the dragoons. But from the side of the river no one came with assistance. The enemy had let Kmita pass the ford purposely, and then covered the ford with such a dreadful shower from cannons and muskets that no living foot could pass through it. The troops of Pan Korsak tried first, and turned back in disorder. Next the squadron of Voinilovich went to the middle of the ford, and turned back, slowly, it is true, for that was the king's regiment, one of the most valiant in the army. But with a loss of 12 noted nobles and 19 soldiers. The water in the ford, which was the only passage through the river, was plashing under the blows of balls as under a dense pouring rain. Cannonballs flew to the other bank, casting around clouds of sand. Gosiewski himself rode up on a gallop, and when he had seen this, he knew that it was impossible for one living man to reach the opposite bank. And still that might decide the fate of the battle. Then the forehead of the hetman frowned sternly. For a while he looked through his glass along the whole line of the enemy's troops, and cried to the orderly, "Rush to Hassan Bay. Let the horde pass the deep bank as it can, and strike the tabor. What they find in the wagons will be theirs. There are no cannon there, it will be only hand to hand." The horseman sprang forward with what breath was in his horse, but the hetman advanced to where under willows on the meadow stood the Luda squadron, and halted before it. Wołodyjowski was at the head of the squadron, gloomy and silent, but he looked in the eyes of the hetman, and his mustaches quivered. "What do you think?" asked the hetman. "Will the Tartars cross?" "The Tartars will cross, but Kmita will perish," answered the little knight. "As God lives," cried the hetman, suddenly. "This Kmita, if he had a head on his shoulders, might win the battle, not perish." Wołodyjowski said nothing. Still he thought, it was necessary either not to send any regiment across the river, or to send 5. The hetman looked a while yet through his glass at the distant confusion which Kmita was making beyond the river. But the little knight, not being able to endure any longer, drew near him, and holding his saber point upward, said, "Your worthiness, if there were an order, would try the ford again." "Stop," said Gosiewski, rather sharply, "it is enough that those will perish." "They are perishing already," replied Wołodyjowski. And in truth the uproar was becoming more definite and greater every moment. Evidently Kmita was retreating to the river. "As God lives, I wanted that," cried the hetman, suddenly. And he sprang like a thunderbolt to Voinilovich's squadron. In fact, Kmita was retreating. After they had met the Red Dragoons, his men fought with their last strength. But the breath was already failing in their breasts, their wearied hands were drooping, and bodies were falling faster and faster. Only hope that aid might come any moment from beyond the river kept courage in them yet. Half an hour more passed, and the cry of "Strike" was heard no longer. But to the aid of the Red Dragoons sprang Boguslav's regiment of heavy cavalry. "Death is coming," thought Kmita, seeing them approaching from the flank. But he was a soldier who never had a doubt, for a moment, not only of his life, but of victory. Long and hazardous practice had given him also great knowledge of war. Therefore lightning at dusk does not flash and then die out so quickly as the following thought flashed to the head of Pan Andrei: evidently the Poles could not cross the ford to the enemy. And since they could not, he would lead the enemy to them. Boguslav's regiment was coming on at full sweep, and not more than 100 yards distant. In a moment they could strike and scatter his Tartars. Pan Andrei raised the pipe to his mouth, and whistled so shrilly that the nearest dragoon horses rose on their haunches. That instant other pipes of the Tartar leaders repeated the whistle, and not so swiftly does the whirlwind twist the sand as that Shambol turned its horses in flight. The remnant of the mailed cavalry, the Red Dragoons, and Boguslav's regiment sprang after them with all speed. The shouts of the officers, "Naprozad, forward," and "God Mitus, God with us," rang like a storm, and a marvelous sight was seen then. Over the broad meadow rushed the disordered and confused Shambol of Tartars, straight to the ford, which was rained on with bullets and balls, and they tore onward, as if carried with wings. Every Tartar lay on the horse, flattened himself, hit himself in the mane and the neck, in such fashion that had it not been for the cloud of arrows flying back toward the cavalry, it might be said that the horses were rushing on riderless. After them, with roaring, shouting, and trampling, followed gigantic men, with upraised swords gleaming in their right hands. The ford was nearer and nearer. There was half a furlong left yet, and evidently the Tartar horses were using their last strength, for the distance between them and the cavalry was quickly decreasing. A few moments later the front ranks of the pursuers began to cut with their swords the Tartars closing the rear. The ford was right there, it seemed that in a few springs the horses would be in it. Suddenly something wonderful happened. Behold, when the Shambol had run to the ford, a shrill whistle of pipes was heard again on the wings, and the whole body, instead of rushing into the river to seek safety on the other bank, opened in two, and with the speed of swallows sprang to the right and left, with and against the flow of the river. But the heavy regiments, rushing right on their shoulders with the highest horse speed, raced into the ford with the same force. And only when in the water did the horsemen begin to hold in their furious beasts. The cannon, which up to that moment had been showering a rain of iron on the gravel, were silent in a second. The gunners had to spare their own army. But Gosiewski was waiting for precisely that instant as for salvation. The cavalry were hardly in the water when the terrible royal squadron of Voinilovich rushed at it like a hurricane. Then the Lauda, the Corsic, the two squadrons of the hetman, and the volunteer squadron, after that, the armored squadron of Prince Michael Radziwill. A terrible shout, "Kill, slay!" thundered in the air, and before the Prussian regiments could halt, concentrate, use their swords, the Voinilovich squadron had scattered them as a whirl of air scatters leaves. They crushed the Red Dragoons, pushed back Boguslav's regiment, cut it in two, and drove it over the field toward the main army of Prussia. In one moment the river was red with blood. The cannon began to play again. But too late, for 8 squadrons of Lithuanian cavalry were sweeping with thunder and roar over the meadow, and the whole battle was transferred to the other side of the river. The hetman was flying with one of his own squadrons, his face radiant with joy, and with fire in his eyes, for once he had the cavalry beyond the river, he was certain of victory. The squadrons, emulating one another in slashing and thrusting, drove before them the remnant of the dragoons and the cavalry, which fell in a dense body. For the heavy horses were not able to flee swiftly, and merely covered the pursuers against missiles from the front. Meanwhile Waldeck, Boguslav, Radziwill, and Israel sent forward all their cavalry to restrain the onset, and hastened themselves to put the infantry in line. Regiment after regiment ran out of the tabor, and took their places on the plain. They thrust the butts of their heavy spears into the earth, with the heads pointing forward, inclined like a fence to the enemy. In the next rank musketeers stretched forward the barrels of their muskets. Between the quadrangles of regiments they placed cannon in hot haste. Neither Boguslav nor Waldeck or Israel flattered themselves that their cavalry could restrain that of the Poles very long, and their whole hope was in the artillery and the infantry. Meanwhile in front of the infantry the mounted regiments struck breast against breast. But that happened which the Prussian leaders foresaw. The pressure of the Lithuanian cavalry was so terrible that their opponents could not restrain them for one moment, and the first hussar regiments split them as a wedge splits wood. And went without breaking a lance through the dense mass, as a ship driven by strong wind goes through waves. The streamers were visible nearer and nearer, at times the heads of the hussar horses rose above the throng of the Prussians. "On your guard!" cried the officers, standing in the quadrangle of infantry. At this word the Prussian soldiers braced themselves more firmly on their feet, and strained their arms holding the spears. And all hearts were beating violently, for the terrible hussars had come wholly in sight, and were bearing down straightway against them. "Fire!" was the word of command. Muskets rattled in the second and third ranks of the quadrangle. Smoke covered the men. A moment later the roar of the coming squadron was nearer. "They are right there." All at once, amid the smoke, the first rank of infantry see there above them, almost over their heads, thousands of horses' hoofs, wide nostrils, inflamed eyes, a crash of broken spears is heard. A fearful shout rends the air, Polish voices shouting, "Slay," and German voices, "Gott erbarm dich meiner, God have mercy on me." That regiment is broken, crushed. But in the spaces between other regiments cannon begin to play. Other squadrons come up. Each one strikes after a moment on a forest of lances. But perhaps not every one will break the forest which it strikes, for none has such terrible force as Voinilovich's squadron. Shouting increases on the whole field of battle. Nothing can be seen. But from the mass of combatants groups of yellow infantry escape in disorder, fleeing from some regiment which evidently was also beaten. Horsemen in grey colors pursue, cut, and trample these men, and shout, "Lauda! Lauda!" That was Wołodyjowski, who with his squadron had fought against a second quadrangle. But others were sticking, yet victory might still incline to the Prussians, especially as at the Tabor stood 2 regiments intact, which, since the Tabor was safe, might be summoned at any moment. Waldeck had in truth lost his head. Israel was not present, for he had been sent with the cavalry, but Boguslav was watching and managing everything. He led the whole battle, and seeing the increase of great peril, sent Pan Bais for those regiments. Bais urged on his horse, and half an hour later returned bareheaded, with terror and despair in his face. "The horde is in the Tabor," shouted he, hurrying up to Boguslav. At that moment unearthly howling was heard on the right wing. This howling came nearer and nearer. Suddenly appeared crowds of Swedish horsemen approaching in terrible panic. After them were fleeing weaponless, bareheaded infantry. After the infantry, in confusion and disorder, came wagons drawn by wild and terrified horses. All this mass was rushing at random from the Tabor toward the infantry in the meadow. In a moment they fell on the infantry, put them into disorder, scattered them, especially when in front they were pressed by Lithuanian cavalry. "Hassan Bey has reached the Tabor," cried Gosiewski, with ecstasy, and he let out his last 2 squadrons like falcons from their rest. At the same moment that these 2 squadrons strike the infantry in front, their own wagons rush against them on the flank. The last quadrangles burst as if under the stroke of a hammer. Of the whole brilliant Swedish-Prussian army there is formed one gigantic mass, in which the cavalry are mingled with the infantry. Men are overturning, trampling, and suffocating one another. They throw off their clothing, cast away their arms. The cavalry press them, cut them, crush them, mash them. It is no longer a battle lost, it is a ruin, one of the most ghastly of the war. Boguslav, seeing that all was lost, resolved to save at least himself and some of the cavalry. With superhuman exertion he collected a few hundred horsemen, and was fleeing along the left wing in the direction of the river's course. He had already escaped from the main whirl, when Prince Michael Radziwill, leading his own hussars, struck him on the flank and scattered his whole detachment at a blow. After this Boguslav's men fled singly or in small groups. They could be saved only by the speed of their horses. In fact, the hussars did not pursue, but struck on the main body of infantry, which all the other squadrons were cutting to pieces. The broken detachment fled over the field like a scattered herd of deer. Boguslav, on Kmita's black steed, is rushing like the wind, striving in vain by cries to gather around him even a few tens of men. No one obeys him. Each man flees on his own account, glad that he has escaped from the disaster, and that he has no enemy in front of him. But rejoicing was vain. They had not gone 1,000 yards when howling was heard in front, and a grey host of Tartars sprang forth from the river, near which they had been lurking till then. This was Kmita with his men. Leaving the field, after he had brought the enemy to the ford, he turned so as to cut off retreat to the fugitives. The Tartars, seeing the cavalry scattered themselves in a moment to catch them more easily, and a murderous pursuit began. 2 or 3 Tartars cut off one trooper, and he rarely defended himself. More frequently he seized his rapier by the point, and extended the hilt to the Tartars, calling for mercy. But the Tartars, knowing that they could not lead these prisoners home, took only officers who could give ransom. The common soldiers received a knife in the throat, and died, unable to say even God. Those who fled to the last were stabbed in the back and shoulders. Those under whom the horses did not fall were caught with lariats. Kmita rushed for a time over the field, hurling down horsemen and seeking Boguslav with his eyes. At last he beheld him, and knew him at once by the horse, by the blue ribbon, and the hat with black ostrich feathers. A cloud of white steam surrounded the prince. For just the moment before 2 Nogais had attacked him. One he killed with a pistol shot, and the other he thrust through with a rapier. Then seeing a larger party rushing from one side, and Kmita from the other, he pressed his horse with spurs, and shot on like a hunted deer followed by hounds. More than 50 men rushed in a body after him, but not all the horses ran equally, so that soon the 50 formed a long serpent, the head of which was Boguslav and the neck Kmita. The prince bent forward in his saddle. The black horse appeared not to touch the earth with his feet, but was black over the green grass, like a swallow sweeping close to the ground. The chestnut stretched his neck like a crane, put back his ears, and seemed as if trying to spring from his skin. Single willows, clumps of them, groups of alder, shot past. The Tartars were behind, a furlong, 2, 3 furlongs, but they ran and ran. Kmita threw his pistols from the holsters to lighten the horse's burden. With eyes fastened on Boguslav, with fixed lips, he almost lay on the neck of the horse, pricked his foaming sides with spurs, till soon the foam falling to the earth became rose-colored. But the distance between him and the prince not only did not decrease a single inch, but began to increase. Woe, thought Pan Andrei, no horse on earth can overtake that one. And when after a few springs the distance increased still more, he straightened himself in the saddle, let the sword drop on its pendant, and putting his hands around his mouth, shouted in a trumpet-like voice, "Flee, traitor, flee before Kmita. I will get you, if not today, tomorrow." These words had barely sounded in the air, when on a sudden the prince, who heard them, looked around, and seeing that Kmita alone was pursuing, instead of fleeing farther described a circle, and with rapier in hand rushed upon him. Pan Andrei gave forth a terrible cry of joy, and without lessening speed raised his saber for a blow. "Corpse! Corpse!" shouted the prince. And wishing to strike the more surely, he restrained his horse. Kmita, when he had come up, held in his own beast till his hoofs sank in the earth, and rapier met saber. They closed in such fashion that the two horses formed almost one body. A terrible sound of steel was heard, quick as thought. No eye could catch the lightning-like movement of rapier and saber, nor distinguish the prince from Kmita. At times Boguslav's hat appeared black, at times Kmita's steel morion gleamed. The horses whirled around each other. The swords clinked more and more terribly. Boguslav, after a few strokes, ceased to despise his opponent. All the terrible thrusts which he had learned from French masters were parried. Sweat was now flowing freely from his face with the rouge and white, he felt weariness in his right arm already. Wonder seized him, then impatience, then rage, therefore he determined to finish, and he thrust so terribly that the hat fell from his head. Kmita warded with such force that the prince's rapier flew to the side of the horse, and before Boguslav could defend himself again, Kmita cut him with the very end of the saber in the forehead. "Christ!" cried the prince in German, rolling to the earth. He fell on his back. Pan Andrei was as if stunned for the moment, but recovered quickly. He dropped his saber on its pendant, made the sign of the cross, sprang from his horse, and seizing the hilt, again approached the prince. He was terrible. For pale as a sheet from emotion, his lips were pressed, and inexorable hatred was in his face. Behold his mortal enemy, and such a powerful one, lying now at his feet in blood, still alive and conscious, but conquered, and not with foreign weapons nor with foreign aid. Boguslav looked at him with widely opened eyes, watching carefully every move of the victor, and when Kmita stood there above him, he cried quickly, "Do not kill me! Ransom!" Kmita, instead of answering, stood with his foot on Boguslav's breast, and pressed with all his power. Then he placed the point of his saber on the prince's throat so that the skin yielded under the point, he only needed to move his hand, to press more firmly. But he did not kill him at once. He wished to sate himself yet with the sight, and make the death of his enemy more grievous. He transfixed Boguslav's eyes with his own eyes, and stood above him, as a lion stands above an overthrown buffalo. The prince, from whose forehead blood was flowing more and more copiously, so that the whole upper part of his head was as if in a pool, spoke again, but now with a greatly stifled voice. For the foot of Pan Andrei was crushing his breast. "The maiden, listen." Barely had Pan Andrei heard these words when he took his foot from Boguslav's breast, and raised his sword. "Speak," said he. But Boguslav only breathed deeply for a time, at last, with a voice now stronger, he said. "The maiden will die, if you kill me. The orders are given." "What have you done with her?" asked Kmita. "Spare me, and I will give her to you. I swear on the gospel." Pan Andrei struck his forehead with his fist. It was to be seen for a time that he was struggling with himself and with his thoughts. Then he said, "Hear me, traitor. I would give 100 such degenerate ruffians for one hair of hers. But I do not believe you, you oath-breaker." "On the gospel," repeated the prince. "I will give you a safe conduct and an order in writing." "Let it be so. I will give you your life, but I will not let you out of my hands. You will give me the letter, but meanwhile I will give you to the Tartars, with whom you will be in captivity." "Agreed," answered Boguslav. "Remember," said Pan Andrei, "your princely rank did not preserve you from my hand, nor your army, nor your fencing. And be assured that as many times as you cross my path, or do not keep word, nothing will save you, even though you were made Emperor of Germany. Recognize me. Once I had you in my hands, now you are lying under my feet." "Consciousness is leaving me," said the prince. "Pan Kmita, there must be water nearby. Give me to drink, and wash my wound." "Die, parricide," answered Kmita. But the prince, secure of life, recovered all his self-command, and said, "You are foolish, Pan Kmita. If I die, she too." Here his lips grew pale. Kmita ran to see if there was not some ditch near at hand, or even some pool. The prince fainted, but for a short time. He revived, happily for himself, when the first Tartar, Selim, son of Gotsi Aga, the banneret among Kmita's Tartars, was coming up, and seeing the enemy weltering in blood, determined to pin him to the earth with the spear point of the banner. The prince in that terrible moment still had strength sufficient to seize the point, which, being loosely fastened, fell from the staff. The sound of that short struggle brought back Pan Andrei. "Stop! Son of a dog," cried he, running from a distance. The Tartar, at the sound of the familiar voice, pushed up to his horse with fear. Kmita commanded him to go for water, and remained himself with the prince. For from afar were to be seen approaching at a gallop the Kyemliches, Soroka, and the whole Shambul, who, after they had caught all the horsemen, came to seek their leader. Seeing Pan Andrei, the faithful Nogais threw up their caps with loud shouts. Akba Ulan sprang from his horse and began to bow to him, touching with his hand his forehead, his mouth, and his breast. Others, smacking their lips, in Tartar fashion, looked with greediness into the eyes of the conquered. Some rushed to seize the two horses, the chestnut and the black, which were running at a distance each with flying mane. "Akba Ulan," said Kmita, "this is the leader of the army which we conquered this morning, Prince Boguslav Radziwill. I give him to you. And do you keep him, for dead or alive they will pay you for him liberally. Now take care of him, put on him a lariat, and lead him to camp." "Allah! Allah! We thank the leader. We thank the conqueror," cried all the Tartars in one voice, and again was heard the smacking of 1,000 lips. Kmita mounted and went with a part of the Tartars to the field of battle. From a distance he saw the standard-bearers with their standards, but of the squadrons there were only a few men present, the rest had gone in pursuit of the enemy. Crowds of camp servants were busy on the battlefield, plundering the corpses and fighting here and there with the Tartars, who were plundering also. The latter looked specially terrible, with knives in their hands, and with arms stained to the elbows. You would have said that a flock of crows had dropped from the clouds to the battle plain. Their wild laughter and shouts were heard over the whole meadow. Some holding in their lips knives still steaming drew with both hands dead men by the feet. Others in sport threw at one another severed heads. Some were filling bags. Others, as in a bazaar, were holding up bloody garments, praising their value, or examining the weapons which they had taken. Kmita passed over the field where he had first met the cavalry. Bodies of men and horses, cut with swords, lay scattered there. But where squadrons had cut infantry, there were whole piles of corpses, and pools of stiffened blood plashed underfoot like muddy water in a swamp. It was difficult to advance through the fragments of broken lances, muskets, corpses, overturned wagons, and troops of Tartars pushing around. Gosiewski was still on the entrenchment of the fortified camp, and with him were Prince Michael Radziwill, Wojnalowicz, Wołodyjowski, Korsak, and a number of men. From this height they took in with their eyes the field far away to its uttermost edges, and were able to estimate the whole extent of the victory and the enemy's defeat. Kmita, on beholding these gentlemen, hastened his pace. And Gosiewski, since he was not only a fortunate warrior but an honorable man without a shadow of envy in his heart, had barely seen Pan Andrei, when he cried, "Here comes the real victor. He is the cause of winning the day. I first declare this in public. Gracious gentlemen, thank Pan Babinik, for had it not been for him we could not have crossed the river." "Vivat Babinik!" cried a number of voices. "Vivat, vivat! Where did you learn war, O soldier?" cried the hetman, with enthusiasm, "that you know what to do in a moment?" Kmita did not answer, for he was too tired. He merely bowed on every side, and passed his hand over his face, soiled with sweat and with powder smoke. His eyes gleamed with an uncommon light, and still the vivats sounded incessantly. Division after division returned from the field on foaming horses. And those who came joined their voices from full breasts in honor of Babinik. Caps flew into the air, whoso had a pistol still loaded gave fire. Suddenly Kmita stood in the saddle, and raising both hands high, shouted, "Vivat Yen Casimir, our Lord and gracious Father!" Here there was such a shout as if a new battle had begun. Unspeakable enthusiasm seized all. Prince Michael ungirded his saber, which had a hilt set with diamonds, and gave it to Kmita. The hetman threw his own costly cloak on the shoulders of the hero, who again raised his hands. "Vivat our hetman, victorious leader! May he increase and flourish," answered all, in a chorus. Then they brought together the captured banners, and thrust them into the embankment at the feet of the leaders. The enemy had not taken one of theirs. There were Prussian of the general militia, nobles, Swedish, and Boguslav flags, the whole rainbow of them was waving at the embankment. "One of the greatest victories of this war," cried the hetman. "Israel and Waldeck are in captivity, the colonels have fallen or are in captivity, the army is cut to pieces." Here he turned to Kmita. "Pan Babinik, you were on that side, you must have met Boguslav, what has happened to him?" Here Pan Michael looked diligently into Kmita's eyes, but Kmita said quickly, "God has punished Boguslav with this hand." Then he stretched forth his right hand. But at that moment the little knight threw himself into his arms. "Jędrek," cried he, "I am not envious. May God bless you." "You formed my hand," answered Pan Andrei, with effusion. But a further expression of brotherly feeling was stopped by Pan Michael Radziwill. "Is my cousin killed?" asked he, quickly. "Not killed," answered Kmita, "for I granted him life. But he is wounded and captive, and over there my nogais are bringing him." At these words astonishment was depicted on Wołodyjowski's face, and the eyes of the knight were turned to the plain, on which appeared a party of some tens of Tartars approaching slowly. At last, when they had passed a group of broken wagons, they came within some tens of yards of the entrenchment. The hetman and the officers saw that the Tartar riding in advance was leading a prisoner. All recognized Boguslav, but in what a change of fortune! He, one of the most powerful lords in the Commonwealth, he, who even yesterday was dreaming of independent rule. He, a prince of the German Empire, was walking now with a lariat around his neck, at the side of a Tartar horse, without a hat, with bloody head bound in a filthy rag. But such was the venom in the hearts of the knights against this magnate that his terrible humiliation did not excite the pity of any. And nearly all mouths shouted at the same moment, "Death to the traitor! Bear him apart on sabers! Death, death!" Prince Michael covered his eyes with his hand, for still that was a Radziwill led with such humiliation. Suddenly he grew red and shouted. "Gracious gentlemen! That is my cousin, that is my blood, and I have spared neither life nor property for the country. He is my enemy who will raise a hand against that ill-fated man." The knights were silent at once. Prince Michael was universally beloved for his bravery, liberality, and devotion to the country. Even when all Lithuania fell into the hands of the Northerners, he alone defended himself in Nyesvyej, and in the time of the Swedish wars he contemned the persuasions of Prince Janusz, and was one of the first to join the Confederacy of Tishovtsi. His voice therefore found hearing at once. Finally, it may be that no one wished to oppose so powerful a man. It is enough that the sabers were placed at once in the scabbards, and even some officers, clients of the Radziwills, exclaimed, "Take him from the Tartars. Let the Commonwealth judge him, but let not honorable blood be insulted by pagans." "Take him from the Tartars," repeated the prince, "we will find surety, and he will pay the ransom himself. Pan Voinilovich, move your men and let them take him by force, if it is impossible otherwise." "I offer myself as a surety to the Tartars," said Pan Noinsky. Then Wołodyjowski pushed up to Kmita and said, "Jędrek, what have you done? He will go safely out of this trouble." Kmita sprang forward like a wounded wildcat. "With the permission of your highness," cried he. "This is my prisoner. I granted him life, but under conditions to which he swore by his heretical gospel. And may I fall dead here if he will go out of the hands into which I gave him before he fulfills everything." When he had said this, he struck his horse, blocked the road, and his inborn impulsiveness had almost carried him away. For his face began to writhe, he distended his nostrils, and his eyes began to cast lightning. Meanwhile Voinilovich pressed him with his horse. "Aside, Pan Babinik," cried he. "Aside, Pan Voinilovich!" roared Kmita, and struck with the hilt of his saber Voinilovich's horse with such force that the steed tottered on his legs as if struck by a ball and dug the ground with his nostrils. Then there rose a fierce shout among the knights, so that Gosiewski pushed forward and cried, "Silence, gentlemen! Gracious prince, in virtue of my authority as hetman, I declare that Pan Babinik has a right to the prisoner, and that whoso wishes to free him from Tartar hands must give guarantee to his conqueror." Prince Michael mastered his indignation, calmed himself, and said, directing his speech to Pan Andrei, "Say what you wish. That he observe the conditions with me before he leaves captivity. But he will keep them when he is free. Impossible. I do not believe him. Then I swear for him, by the Most Holy Mother, whom I recognize, and on the word of a knight, that all will be observed to you. In the opposite case you may make demand on my honor and property." "That is sufficient for me," said Kmita. "Let Pan Noinsky go as hostage, for otherwise the Tartars will make resistance." "I will give way on your word." "I thank you, cavalier," answered Prince Michael. "Do not fear, either, that he will receive his freedom at once, for I will give him to the hetman by right, and he will remain a prisoner until the king pronounces sentence." "That will be so," answered the hetman, and ordering Voinilovich to sit on a fresh horse, for that one was hardly able to stand, he sent him with Pan Noinsky for the prince. But the affair did not pass easily yet, for Hassan Bey made a terrible resistance, and only the sight of Pan Noinsky and the promise of a ransom of 100,000 thalers could pacify him. In the evening Prince Boguslav found himself in the tents of Gosiewski. He was cared for with attention. 2 physicians did not leave him for a moment, and both guaranteed his life, for the wound, since it had been given with the very end of the saber, was not too serious. Wołodyjowski could not forgive Kmita for having granted the prince his life, and from sorrow avoided him all day. It was only in the evening that Pan Andrei himself went to Pan Michael's tent. "Fear the wounds of God," cried the little knight, at sight of him. "I should have expected this of any other than of you, to let that traitor go alive." "Listen to me, Michael, before you condemn me," said Kmita, gloomily. I had him under my foot and held my saber point at his throat, and then do you know what the traitor said? That there were commands given to kill Olenka in Torogi if he should be slain. What had I, unfortunate man, to do? I purchased her life with his life. What had I to do? By the cross of Christ, what had I to do? Here Pan Andrei began to pull his hair, to stamp, from bewilderment, and Wołodyjowski thought for a while, then said, I understand your despair. But still, you see, you have let go a traitor who may bring grievous suffering to the country. There is no denying, Jędrek, that you have rendered wonderful service today. But at last you sacrificed the public good to your own private ends. And what would you have done if you were told that there was a knife at the throat of Panna Anuzia? Pan Michael's mustaches quivered fiercely. I do not offer myself as an example. What would I have done? But Pan Yen, who has a Roman soul, would not have let him live. And besides, I am certain that God would not have let innocent blood flow for the reason he mentioned. Let me do penance. Punish me, O God, not according to my heavy sin, but according to thy mercy, for to sign a sentence against that dove. Here Kmita closed his eyes. Angels forfend. Never, never. It is past, said Wołodyjowski. Here Pan Andrei took a paper out of his bosom. See, Michael, what I obtained. This is a command to Sienkiewicz, to all the officers of Radziwill, and to the Swedish commandants. We forced him to write it, though he could barely move his hand. Prince Michael himself saw to that. This is freedom for her, safety for her. I will lie in the form of a cross every day for a year, I will have myself scourged, I will build a church, but I will not sacrifice her life. I have not a Roman soul. Well, I am not a Cato like Pan Yen, true. But I will not sacrifice her. No, by 100 thunders, I will not, even if at last I am roasted in hell on a spit. Kmita did not finish, for Pan Michael sprang up to him and stopped his mouth with his hand, crying in a terrified voice, do not blaspheme, for you will draw the vengeance of God on her. Beat your breast, quickly, quickly. And Pan Andrei began to beat his breast, mea culpa. Mea culpa. Mea maxima culpa. At last the poor soldier burst into loud weeping, for he did not know himself what to do. Pan Michael let him have his cry out, then he pacified him, and asked, and what will you undertake now? I will go with my men whither I am sent, as far as Burgi. Only let the men and horses draw breath first. On the road I will shed as much heretical blood as I can, to the glory of God. And you will have your merit. Do not lose heart, Jędrek. God is merciful. I will go directly ahead. All Prussia is open at present, only here and there shall I light upon small garrisons. Pan Michael sighed, oh, I would go with you as gladly as to paradise. But I must keep my command. You are fortunate to lead volunteers. Jędrek, listen, brother. And when you find both, take care of that one, so that no evil befall her. God knows, she may be predestined to me. When he had said this, the little knight cast himself into the arms of Pan Andrei. Chapter 93. Olenka and Anuzia, having freed themselves from Torogi, under the protection of Braun, came successfully to the sword-bearers' party, which at that time was near Alsha. Therefore not very far from Torogi. The old noble when he saw them both in good health would not believe his eyes at first. Then he fell to weeping from delight, and finally came to such military enthusiasm that for him danger existed no longer. Let not only Boguslav appear, but the King of Sweden himself with all his power, Pan Billevik was ready to defend his maidens against every enemy. I will fall, said he, before a hair shall drop from your heads. I am no longer the man whom you knew in Torogi, and I think that the Swedes will long remember Gerlikol, Yesvoynia, and those beatings which I gave them at Rosieni itself. It is true that the traitor Sienkiewicz attacked us unawares and routed us, but you see several hundred sabres on service. Pan Billevich did not exaggerate greatly, for in truth it was difficult to recognize in him the former prisoner of Trilogy fallen in courage. He had another mind now. His energy had revived in the field, on his horse, he found himself in his element, and being a good soldier, he had really handled the Swedes several times roughly. And since he had great authority in the neighborhood, the nobles and common people flocked to him willingly. And even from some remote districts a Billevich brought him now between 10 and 20 horsemen, now some tens of horsemen. Pan Tomasz's party was composed of 300 peasant infantry and about 500 horsemen. It was rare that any man in the infantry had a gun. The greater number were armed with scythes and forks. The cavalry was a collection of the wealthier nobles, who betook themselves to the forest with their attendants, and of the poorer nobles from villages. Their arms were better than those of the infantry, but greatly varied. Hop poles served as lances for many, some carried rich family weapons, but frequently of a past age. The horses, of various breeds and quality, were not fitted for one rank. With such troops the sword-bearer could block the road to Swedish patrols, he might cut off even detachments of cavalry, he might clear forests and villages of plunderers, whose numerous bands, composed of Swedish fugitives, Prussian and local ruffians, were busied with robbery. But he could not attack any town. The Swedes had grown wiser. Immediately after the outbreak of the rebellion those who were scattered in quarters in the villages were cut down throughout Jmud and Lithuania. But now those who had survived remained mostly in fortified towns, which they left only for short expeditions. Therefore the fields, forests, hamlets, and smaller towns were in Polish hands. But the larger towns were held by Swedes, and there was no power to dislodge them. The sword-bearer's party was one of the best, others could effect still less than he. On the boundary of Livonia the insurgents had grown so bold, it is true, that they besieged Burgi twice, and at the second attack it was forced to surrender. But that temporary preponderance came from this, that Pontus de Lagarde had assembled to the defense of Riga against the forces of the Tsar all the troops from the neighboring districts of Livonia. His brilliant victories, rarely equaled in history, caused the belief, however, that war in that quarter would soon be at an end. And that he would bring to Jmud new Swedish troops intoxicated with triumphs. Still there was safety enough in the forests at that time. And numerous parties of insurgents capable of undertaking little alone might still be certain that the enemy would not seek them in deep wildernesses. Therefore Pan Billevich rejected the thought of hiding in Bielovich, for the road to it was very long, and on the way were many considerable places with large garrisons. "The Lord God has given a dry autumn," said he to the maidens, "therefore it is easier to live sub Jove, in the open air. I will have a regular tent made for you. I will find a woman to wait on you, and you will stay in the camp. In these times there is no safer refuge than the forest. My Billevich is burned to the ground. Country houses are infested by ravagers and sometimes even by Swedish parties. Where could you incline your heads more safely than with me, who have several hundred sabers at my command? Rains will come later, then some cabin will be found for you in the forest." This idea pleased Panna Anusia greatly. For in the party were many young Bilevichs, polite cavaliers, and besides it was said continually that Pan Babinich was marching in that direction. Anusia hoped that when he came he would drive out the Swedes in a twinkle, and then would be what God would give. Olenka judged also that it was safest with the party. But she wished to retreat far from Trilogy, fearing the pursuit of Sakovich. "Let us go to Vodokty," said she, "there we shall be among our own people. Although it is burned, Mitrany and all the neighboring villages are there. It is impossible that the whole country is turned into a desert. Lauda will defend us in case of danger." "But all the Lauda men have gone with Wołodyjowski," said your Billevich, in opposition. "The old men and the youths have remained, and even the women there are able to defend in case of need. Besides, forests are greater there than here, the Domasheviches, the hunters, or the smoky Gostieviches will take us to Rogovsk, where no enemy will find us. And when I have secured the camp and you, I will attack the Swedes, and cut to pieces those who dare to touch the rim of the wilderness, said Pan Billevik. This is an excellent idea. We have nothing to do here, it is possible to render greater service. Who knows whether the sword-bearer did not seize that idea of Olenka so quickly because he too in his soul was somewhat afraid of Sienkiewicz, who brought to despair, might be terrible. The advice, however, was wise in itself, therefore it pleased all immediately. The sword-bearer sent out infantry that very day under command of Billevik, so as to push forward by the forest in the direction of Krakow. But he went forward himself with the cavalry 2 days later, obtaining in advance reliable intelligence as to whether there had not gone out from Kyedani or Rosieni, between which he had to march some considerable bodies of Swedish troops. Pan Billevik marched slowly and carefully. The ladies traveled in peasants' wagons, and sometimes on ponies which the sword-bearer had provided. Anusia, who had received as a gift from Billevik a light saber, hung it bravely at her side, and in a cap, placed jauntily on her head, brought up the squadron like some captain. The march amused her, the sabers glittering in the sun, and the fires disposed around at night. Young officers and soldiers were greatly pleased with the lady, and she shot her eyes around in every direction on the march. She let her tresses fall so as to braid them 3 times daily over the banks of bright brooks, which for her took the place of a mirror. She said often that she wished to see a battle, so as to give an example of bravery, but in very truth she did not want a battle at all. She wanted only to subdue the hearts of all the young warriors. In fact, she did subdue an unreckoned number of them. Olenka too revived again, as it were, after leaving Torogi. There the uncertainty of her future and continual fear were killing her. Now in the depths of the forest she felt safer. The wholesome air brought back her strength. The sight of soldiers, of weapons, the movement and bustle of camp life, acted like balsam on her wearied soul. And the march of troops acted agreeably on her also. Possible dangers did not alarm her in the least, for knightly blood was in her veins. Appearing less frequently before the soldiers, not permitting herself to gallop on a pony in front of the ranks, she attracted fewer glances, but general respect surrounded her. The mustached faces of the soldiers were laughing at sight of Anusia, heads were uncovered when Olenka drew near the fires. That was changed later to homage. But it did not pass without this, that some heart beat for her in a youthful breast, but eyes did not dare to gaze at her so directly as at that brunette of the Ukraine. They advanced through forests and thickets, often sending scouts ahead. And only on the 7th day did they arrive late at night in Lubek, which, lying on the border of the Luda region, formed as it were the entrance to it. The horses were so tired that in spite of Olenka's opposition it was impossible to go farther. Billevik therefore forbade the lady to find fault, and disposed his party for the halt. He himself with the young ladies occupied the house, for the night was foggy and very cold. By a marvelous chance the house had not been burned. The enemy had spared it probably through the command of Prince Janusz Radziwill, because it was Kmita's. And though the prince learned later of Pan Andrei's secession, he forgot or had not time to give a new order. The insurgents considered the estate as belonging to the Bileviks. The ravagers did not dare to plunder near Luda. Therefore nothing had changed in it. Olenka went under that roof with a terrible feeling of bitterness and pain. She knew every corner there, but almost with each one was bound up some memory of Kmita's betrayal. Before her is the dining hall ornamented with the portraits of the Bileviks and with skulls of wild beasts of the forest. The skulls cracked with bullets are still on the nails. The portraits slashed with sabers are gazing from the walls, as if wishing to say, "Behold, O maiden! Behold, our granddaughter!" It was he who slashed with sacrilegious hand the pictures of our earthly forms, now resting long in their graves. Olenka felt that she could not close an eye in that branded house. It seemed to her that in the dark corners of the rooms were prowling around yet the ghosts of those terrible comrades breathing fire from their nostrils. And how quickly that man, so loved by her, had passed from violence to transgression, from transgression to crimes, from the slashing of portraits to profligacy. To the burning of Upita and Valmontovici, to carrying her off from Vodokty. Further to the service of Radziwill, to treason, crowned with the promise of raising his hand against the king, against the father of the whole Commonwealth. The night went on swiftly, but sleep did not seize the lids of unhappy Olenka. All the wounds of her soul were reopened and began to burn painfully. Shame again was scorching her cheeks. Her eyes dropped no tears in that time, but immeasurable grief surrounded her heart, because it could not find place within that poor heart. Grief for what? For what might have been had he been other, if with his bad habits, wildness, and violence, he had even had an honest heart. If finally he had even a measure in his crimes, if there existed some boundary over which he was incapable of passing? And her heart would have forgiven so much. Anusia saw the suffering of her companion, and understood the cause, for the old sword-bearer had detailed the whole history to her previously. Since she had a kind heart, she came up to Panna Billevich, and throwing her arms around her neck, said, "Olenka, you are writhing from pain in this house." Olenka at first did not wish to speak. Then her whole body trembled like an aspen leaf, and at last a terrible, despairing cry burst from her bosom. Seizing Anusia's hand convulsively, she rested her bright head on that maiden's shoulder. Sobbing now tore her as a whirlwind tears a thicket. Anusia had to wait long before it passed. At last she whispered when Olenka was pacified somewhat, "Let us pray for him." Olenka covered her eyes with both hands. "I cannot," said she, with an effort. After a while, gathering back feverishly the hair which had fallen on her forehead, she began to speak with a gasping voice. "You see, I cannot, you are happy. Your Babinnik is honorable, famous, before God and the country. You are happy, I am not free even to pray. Here, everywhere, is the blood of people, and here are burned ruins. If at least he had not betrayed the country, if he had not undertaken to sell the king. I had forgiven everything before, in Kyedani, for I loved him with my whole heart. But now I cannot, O merciful God. I cannot. I could wish not to live myself, and that he were not living. It is permitted to pray for every soul," said Anusia. "For God is more merciful than men, and knows reasons which often men do not know." When she had said this, Anusia knelt down to pray, and Olenka threw herself on the floor in the form of a cross, and lay thus till daybreak. Next morning the news thundered through the neighborhood that Pan Billevich was in Lauda. At that news all who were living came forth with greeting. Therefore out of the neighboring forests issued decrepit old men, and women with small children. For 2 years no one had sowed any seed, no one had plowed any land. The villages were partly burned and were deserted. The people lived in the forests. Men in the vigor of life had gone with Wołodyjowski or to various parties. Only youths watched and guarded the remnant of cattle, and guarded well, but under cover of the wilderness. They greeted the sword-bearer then as a savior, with a great cry of joy. For to those simple people it seemed that if the sword-bearer had come and the lady was returning to the ancient nest, then there must be an end to war and disasters. In fact, they began at once to return to the villages, and to drive out the half-wild cattle from the deepest forest enclosures. The Swedes, it is true, were not far away, defended by entrenchments in Ponyvayage. But in presence of Bilevich's forces and other neighboring parties which might be summoned in case of need, less attention was paid to them. Pan Tomasz even intended to attack Ponyvayage, so as to clear out the whole district. But he was waiting for more men to rally to his banner, and waiting especially till guns were brought to his infantry. These guns the Domasheviches had secreted in considerable number in the forest. Meanwhile he examined the neighborhood, passing from village to village. But that was a gloomy review at Vodokty. The mansion was burned, and half the village, Mitrany in like manner. Valmontovici of the Butrims, which Kmita had burned in his time, and which had been rebuilt after the fire, by a marvelous chance was untouched. But Drodzikani and Motsky of the Domasheviches was burned to the ground, Patsanelli was half consumed, and Marizi altogether. Goszczuni experienced the harshest fate. For half the people were cut to pieces, and all the men to boys of a few years had their hands cut off by command of Colonel Rosa. So terribly had war trampled those neighborhoods. Such were the results of the treason of Janusz Radziwiłł. But before Billevik had finished his review and stationed his infantry, fresh tidings came, at once joyful and terrible, which rang with thousandfold echo from cottage to cottage. Jurek Billevik, who had gone with a few tens of horses on a reconnaissance to Poniewicz and had seized some Swedes, was the first to learn of the battle at Prostki. Then every report brought more details, so wondrous that they resembled a fable. Pan Gosiewski, it was said, had routed Count Waldeck, Israel, and Prince Boguslav. The army was cut to pieces, the leaders in captivity. All Prussia was blazing in one conflagration. A few weeks later the mouths of men began to repeat one terrible name, the name of Babinik. Babinik, said they, was the main cause of the victory at Prostki. Babinik cut down with his own hand and captured Prince Boguslav. The next news was, Babinik is burning electoral Prussia, is advancing like death toward Jmud, slaying, leaving behind only earth and sky. Then came the end, Babinik has burned Torogi. Sienkiewicz has fled before him, and is hiding in forests. The last event had happened too near to remain long in doubt. In fact, the news was verified perfectly. Anusia during the whole time that news was arriving lived as if dazed. She laughed and wept in turn, stamped her feet when no one believed, and repeated to everyone, whether that one would listen or not. I know Pan Babinik. He brought me from Zamost to Pan Sapieha. He is the greatest warrior in the world. I do not know whether Pan Charniecki is his equal. He is the man who serving under Sapieha crushed Boguslav utterly in the first campaign. He, I am sure that it is no other, conquered him at Prostki. Yes, he can finish Sienkiewicz and 10 like Sienkiewicz, and he will sweep out the Swedes in a month from all Jmud. In fact, her assurances began to be justified speedily. There was not the least doubt that the terrible warrior called Babinik had moved forward from Torogi toward the northern country. At Koltany he defeated Colonel Baldin and cut his troops to pieces, at Varny he scattered the Swedish infantry, which retreated before him at Telsher. At Telsher he won a greater victory over 2 colonels, Norman and Hudenskield, in which the latter fell, and Norman with the survivors did not halt till he reached Zagori, on the very boundary of Jmud. From Telsher Babinik marched to Kurshany, driving before him smaller divisions of Swedes, who took refuge in haste with the more important garrisons. From Torogi and Polanyi to Burgi and Vilkamir the name of the victor was ringing. They told of the cruelties which he permitted himself against the Swedes. It was said that his forces, composed at first of a small chambul of Tartars and little squads of volunteers, increased day after day. For all who were living rushed to him, all parties joined him, but he bound them in bonds of iron and led them against the enemy. Minds were so far occupied by his victories that tidings of the defeat which Pan Gosiewski had sustained from Steinbach at Filipovo passed almost without an echo. Babinik was nearer, and with Babinik they were more occupied. Anusia implored Billevik daily to advance and join the great warrior. Olenka supported her. All the officers and nobles urged, excited by curiosity alone. But to join the warrior was not easy. First, Babinik was in another district. Second, he often disappeared, and was not heard of for weeks, and then appeared again with news of a new victory. Third, all the Swedish soldiers and garrisons, protecting themselves from him, had stopped the road with large forces. Finally, beyond Rosieni a considerable body of troops had appeared under Sienkiewicz, of whom tidings were brought saying that he was destroying everything before him, and torturing people terribly while questioning them concerning Bilevika's party. The sword-bearer not only could not march to Babinik, but he feared that it would soon be too narrow for him near Lauda. Not knowing himself what to begin, he confided to Jurek Bilevik that he intended to withdraw to the forest of Rogovsk on the east. Jurek immediately gave this information to Anusia, and she went straight to the sword-bearer. "Dearest uncle," said she, for she always called him uncle when she wanted to gain something from him, "I hear that we have to flee. Is it not a shame for so celebrated a warrior to flee at the mere report of an enemy?" "Your ladyship must thrust your 3 coppers into everything," said the anxious sword-bearer. "This is not your affair." "Very well, then, retreat, but I will stay here. So that Sienkiewicz will catch you, you'll see." "Sienkiewicz will not catch me, for Pan Babinik will defend me. Especially when he knows where you are. I have said already that we are unable to go to him. But he can come to us. I am his acquaintance. If I could only send a letter to him, I am certain he would come here, after he had beaten Sienkiewicz. He loved me a little, and he would come to rescue me. But who will undertake to carry a letter? It can be sent through the first peasant that comes. It will do no harm, it will do no harm, in no case will it do harm. Olenka has quick wit, but neither are you without it. Even if we had to retreat to the woods this moment before superior force, it would still be well to have Babinik come to these parts, for we can then join him more easily. Try. Messengers will be found, and trusty men." The delighted Anusia began to try so well that same day she found 2 messengers, and not peasants, for one was Henryk Sienkiewicz, the other Braun. Each was to take a letter of the same contents as that which the other carried, so that if one failed the other might deliver the missive to Babinik. With the letter itself Anusia had more trouble. But at last she wrote it in the following words. "In the last extremity I write to you. If you remember me, though I doubt if you do, come to rescue me. By the kindness which you showed me on the road from Zamost, I dare to hope that you will not leave me in misfortune. I am in the party of Pan Bilovic, the sword-bearer of Rosieni, who gave me refuge because I brought his relative, Panna Bilovic, out of captivity in Torogi. And him and us both the enemy, namely, the Swedes, have surrounded on every side, and a certain Pan Sienkiewicz, before whose sinful importunities I had to flee and seek safety in the camp. I know that you did not love me, though God sees that I did you no harm. I wished you well, and I shall wish you well from my whole heart. But though you do not love, rescue a poor orphan from the savage hand of the enemy. God will reward you for it 100-fold, and I will pray for you, whom today I call only my good protector, but hereafter my Savior." When the messengers were leaving the camp, Anusia, considering to what dangers they were exposed, was alarmed, and at last wished to stop them. Even with tears in her eyes she began to implore the sword-bearer not to permit them to go, for peasants might carry the letters, and it would be easier for the peasants to deliver them. But Braun and Henryk Sienkiewicz were so stubborn that no remonstrance could avail. One wished to surpass the other in readiness to serve, but neither foresaw what was awaiting him. A week later Braun fell into the hands of Sienkiewicz, who gave command to flay him, but poor Henryk was shot beyond Poniewicz while fleeing before a Swedish party. Both letters fell into the hands of the enemy. Chapter 94. Sienkiewicz, after he had seized and flayed Braun, arranged at once a joint attack on the Bilovic party with Hamilton, the commandant of Poniewicz, an Englishman in the Swedish service. Babinik had just disappeared somewhere in the forest, and for a number of days no report of him had come. But Sienkiewicz would not have regarded him, even had he been in the neighborhood. He had, it is true, in spite of all his daring, a certain instinctive dread of Babinik, but this time he was ready to perish himself, if he could accomplish his vengeance. From the time of Anusia's flight rage had not ceased for a moment to tear his soul. Deceived calculations, and wounded love especially, brought him to frenzy. And besides the heart was suffering in him. At first he wished to marry Anusia only for the property willed her by her first betrothed, Pan Podbipienta. But later he fell in love with her blindly, and to the death, as only such a man can fall in love. And it went so far that he who feared no one on earth save Boguslav, he before whose glance alone people grew pale, gazed like a dog into the eyes of that maiden, yielded to her. Endured her caprices, carried out all her wishes, strove to divine her thoughts. She used and abused her influence, deluding him with words, with a look, used him as a slave, and finally betrayed him. Sienkiewicz was of those men who consider that only as good and virtuous which is good for them, and as evil and criminal that which brings them harm. In his eyes, therefore, Anusia had committed the most terrible crime, and there was no punishment sufficiently great for her. If the mishap had met another, the starosta would have laughed and jeered at the man, but when it touched his own person, he roared as a wounded wild beast, and thought only of vengeance. He wished to get the guilty woman into his hands, dead or alive. He would have preferred her alive, for then he could exercise a cavalier's vengeance before her death. But if the maiden had to fall in time of attack, he cared little, if only she did not come into possession of another. Wishing to act with certainty, he sent a bribed man to the sword-bearer with a letter as if from Babinnik, in which he announced, in the name of the latter, that he would be in Valmontovici in the course of a week. Billevik believed easily, trusting therefore in the invincible power of Babinnik, and he made no secret of the arrangement. He not only took up his headquarters for good in Valmontovici, but by the announcement of the news he attracted almost all the population of Lauda. What remained of it assembled from the forests, first, because the end of autumn had come, and there were heavy frosts, and second, through pure curiosity alone to see the great warrior. Meanwhile, from the direction of Ponyvij marched toward Valmontovici Hamilton's Swedes, and from the direction of Kyedani was stealing forward in wolf fashion Sienkiewicz. But Sienkiewicz had no suspicion that on his tracks was advancing in wolf fashion also a third man, who without invitation had the habit of coming where people expected him least. Kmita knew not that Olenka was with the Billevik party. In Trilogy, which he ruined with fire and sword, he learned that she had gone with Anusia. But he supposed that they had gone to Byalovij, where Pan Yan's wife was in hiding as well as many other noble women. He might the more easily suppose this, since he knew that Billevik had long intended to take his niece to those impassable forests. It tortured Pan Andrei immensely that he had not found her in Trilogy, but at the same time he was glad that she had escaped from the hands of Sienkiewicz, and would find safe refuge till the end of the war. Not being able to go for her at once to the wilderness, he determined to attack and destroy the enemy in Jmud, until he had crushed them completely. And fortune went with him. For a month and a half victory followed victory, armed men rushed to him in such numbers that soon his Shambul was barely 1/4 of his force. Finally, he drove the enemy out of all western Jmud. But hearing of Sienkiewicz, and having old scores to settle with the starosta, he set out for his own former district, and followed him. In this way both were now drawing near Valmontovici. Billevik, who at first had taken a position not far from the village, had been living there a week, and the thought did not even come to his head that he would soon have such terrible guests. One evening the youthful Butryms, herding horses beyond Valmontovici, informed him that troops had issued from the forest, and were advancing from the south. Billevik was too old and experienced a soldier not to take precautions. Some of his infantry, partly furnished with firearms by the Domasheviches, he placed in the houses recently rebuilt, and some he stationed at the gate. With the cavalry he took possession himself of a broad pasture somewhat in the rear, beyond the fences, and which touched with one side the river. He did this mainly to gain the praise of Babinnik, who must understand skillful dispositions. The place he had chosen was really a strong one. After Kmita had burned Valmontovici, in vengeance for the slaughter of his comrades, the village was rebuilt by degrees. But as later on the Swedish war had stopped work on it, a multitude of beams, planks, and boards were lying on the principal street. Whole piles of them rose up near the gate. And infantry, even slightly trained, might make a protracted defense from behind them. In every case the infantry protected the cavalry from the first onset. Billevik was so eager to exhibit his military skill to Babinnik, that he sent forward a small party to reconnoiter. What was his amazement, and at the first moment alarm, when from a distance and beyond the grove there came to him the sound of musketry. Then his party appeared on the road, but coming at a gallop, with a crowd of enemies at its shoulders. The sword-bearer sprang at once to the infantry to give final orders. But from the grove rushed forth dense groups of the enemy, and advanced locust-like toward Valmontovici, with arms glittering in the setting sun. The grove was near. When they had approached somewhat, the cavalry pushed forward at once on a gallop, wishing to pass the gate at a blow, but the sudden fire of the infantry stopped them on the spot. The first ranks fell back, and even in considerable disorder, only a few brought their horses' breasts to the defences. The sword-bearer recovered meanwhile, and galloping to the cavalry ordered all who had pistols or guns to advance to the aid of the infantry. Evidently the enemy were equally provided with muskets. For after the first onset they began a very violent, though irregular fire. From both sides it thundered now more quickly, now more slowly. The balls whistling came up to the cavalry, struck on the houses, fence, piles of timber. The smoke rose over Valmontovici, the smell of powder filled the street. Anusia had what she wanted, a battle. Both ladies mounted ponies at the first moment, by command of Billevik, so that at a given signal they might retreat with the party should the enemy's forces turn out too great. They were stationed therefore in the rear ranks of the cavalry. But though Anusia had a small saber at her side and a lynx-skin cap on her head, her soul fled at once into her arms. She who knew so well how to take counsel in peace with officers, had not one pinch of energy when she had to stand eye to eye with the sons of Bologna in the field. The whistle and knocking of balls terrified her. The uproar, the racing of orderlies, the rattle of muskets, and the groans of the wounded took away her presence of mind, and the smell of powder stopped the breath in her breast. She grew faint and weak, her face became pale as a kerchief, and she squirmed and whimpered like a little child, till young Pan Olshaw from Kiemner had to hold her by the arms. He held her firmly, more firmly than was needed, and he was ready to hold her in that way to the end of the world. The soldiers around her began to laugh. A knight in petticoats, called voices. Better set hens and pluck feathers. Others cried, Pan Olshaw, that shield has come to your arm, but Cupid will shoot you all the more easily through it. And good humor seized the soldiers. But others preferred to look at Olenka, who bore herself differently. At first, when bullets flew past at some distance she grew pale too, not being able to forbear inclining her head and closing her eyes. But later knightly blood began to act in her, then with face flushed like a rose she reared her head and looked forward with fearless eye. Her distended nostrils drew in as it were with pleasure the smell of powder. Since the smoke grew thicker and thicker at the gate and decreased the view greatly, the daring lady, seeing that the officers were advancing, went with them. To follow more accurately the course of battle, not even thinking of what she was doing. In the throng of cavalry there rose a murmur of praise. Oh, that is blood. That is the wife for a soldier, she is the right kind of volunteer. Vivat Panna Billevik. Let us hasten, gracious gentlemen, for it is worth while before such eyes. The Amazons did not meet muskets better. Cried one of the younger men, forgetting in his enthusiasm that the Amazons lived before the invention of powder. It is time to finish. The infantry have borne themselves well, and the enemy are seriously shattered. In fact, the enemy could do nothing with their cavalry. Every moment they urged on their horses, attacked the gate, but after a salvo drew back in disorder. And as a wave which has fallen upon the flat shore leaves behind mussels, stones, and dead fish, so after each attack a number of bodies of horses and men were left on the road before the gate. At last the onset ceased. Only volunteers came up, firing in the direction of the village with pistols and guns rather thickly, so as to occupy the attention of Bilevika's men. But the sword-bearer, coming out along the gutter of the house, saw a movement in the rear ranks of the enemy toward the fields and thickets extending along the left side of Valmontovici. They will try from that side, cried he, and sent immediately a part of the cavalry between the houses so as to give resistance to the enemy from the gardens. In half an hour a new battle was begun on the left wing of the party and also with firearms. The fenced gardens rendered difficult a hand-to-hand struggle, and equally difficult for both sides. The enemy, however, being extended over a longer line, were less exposed to bullets. The battle was becoming more stubborn and more active, and the enemy did not cease to attack the gate. Billevik was growing uneasy. On the right flank he had a field behind him still free, ending with a stream not very wide, but deep and swampy, through which a passage, especially if in haste, might be difficult. In one place only was there a trodden road to a flat shore along which villagers drove cattle to the forest. The sword-bearer began to look around oftener toward that side. All at once among willows which could be seen through, for they had lost their leaves, he saw in the evening light glittering weapons and a dark cloud of soldiers. "Babinnik is coming," thought he. But at that moment Pan Janstovski, who led the cavalry, rushed up to him. "Swedish infantry are visible from the river," cried he, in terror. "Some treason," cried Pan Tomasz. "By Christ's wounds, gallop with your cavalry against that infantry, otherwise it will attack us on the flank." "There is a great force," answered Janstovski. "Oppose it even for an hour, and we will escape in the rear to the forests." The officer galloped away, and was soon rushing over the field at the head of 200 men. Seeing which the enemy's infantry began to form in the willows to receive the Poles. The squadron urged the horses, and in the willow bushes a musketry fire was soon rattling. Billevik had doubts, not only of victory, but of saving his own infantry. He might withdraw to the rear with a part of the cavalry with the ladies, and seek safety in the forest. But such a withdrawal would be a great defeat, for it meant leaving to the enemy's sword most of the party and the remnant of the population of Lauda, which had collected in Valmontovichi to see Billevik. Valmontovichi itself would be leveled to the ground. There remained still the lone hope that Janstovski would break the infantry. Meanwhile it was growing dark in the sky. But in the village the light increased every moment, for the chips, splinters, and shavings, lying in a heap at the first house near the gate, had caught fire. The house itself caught fire from them, and a red conflagration was rising. By the light of the burning Billevik saw Janstovski's cavalry returning in disorder and panic. After it the Swedish infantry were rushing from the willows, advancing to the attack on a run. He understood then that he must retreat by the only road open. He rushed to the rest of the cavalry, waved his sword and cried, "To the rear, gentlemen, and in order, in order." Suddenly shots were heard in the rear also, mingled with shouts of soldiery. Billevik saw then that he was surrounded, that he had fallen as it were into a trap from which there was neither issue nor rescue. It remained for him only to perish with honor. Therefore he sprang out before the line of cavalry, and cried, "Let us fall one upon the other. Let us not spare our blood for the faith and the country." Meanwhile the fire of the infantry defending the gate and the left side of the village had grown weak, and the increasing shout of the enemy announced their near victory. But what mean those hoarse trumpet sounds in the ranks of Sakiewicz's party, and the rattle of drums in the ranks of the Swedes? Outcries shriller and shriller are heard, in some way wonderful, confused, as if not triumph but terror rings through them. The fire at the gate stops in a moment, as if someone had cut it off with a knife. Groups of Sakiewicz's cavalry are flying at breakneck speed from the left flank to the main road. On the right flank the infantry halt, and then, instead of advancing, begin to withdraw to the willows. "What is this?" cried Billevik. Meanwhile the answer comes from that grove out of which Sakiewicz had issued. And now emerge from it men, horses, squadrons, Horsedale standards, sabres, and march, no, they fly like a storm, and not like a storm, like a tempest. In the bloody gleams of the fire they are as visible as a thing on the hand. They are hastening in thousands. The earth seems to flee from beneath them, and they speed on in dense column. One would say that some monster had issued from the oak grove, and is sweeping across the fields to the village to swallow it. The air flies before them, driven by the impetus. With them go terror and ruin. They are almost there. Now the attack. Like a whirlwind they scatter Sakiewicz's men. "O God! O great God!" cries Billevik, in bewilderment, "These are ours. That must be Babinik." "Babinik," roared every throat after him. "Babinik! Babinik," called terrified voices in Sienkiewicz party. And all the enemy's cavalry wheeled to the right, to escape toward the infantry. The fence is broken with a sharp crash, under the pressure of horses' breasts. The pasture is filled with the fleeing. But the newcomers, on their shoulders already, cut, slash, cut without resting, cut without pity. The whistling of sabers, cries, groans, are heard. Pursuers and pursued fall upon the infantry, overturn, break, and scatter them. At last the whole mass rolls on toward the river, disappears in the brush, clambers out on the opposite bank. Men are visible yet, the chasing continues, with cutting and cutting. They recede. Their sabers flash once again, then they vanish in bushes, in space, and in darkness. Bilovica's infantry began to withdraw from the gate and the houses, which needed no further defense. The cavalry stood for a time in such wonder that deep silence reigned in the ranks. And only when the flaming house had fallen with a crash was some voice heard on a sudden. "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the storm has gone by. Not a foot will come out alive from that hunt," said another voice. "Gracious gentlemen," cried the sword-bearer, suddenly, "shall we not spring at those who came at us in the rear? They are retreating, but we will come up." "Kill, slay," answered a chorus of voices. All the cavalry wheeled around and urged their horses after the last division of the enemy. In Valmontovichi remained only old men, women, children, and the lady with her friend. They quenched the fire in a twinkle. Joy inconceivable seized all hearts. Women with weeping and sobbing raised their hands heavenward, and turning to the point where Babinik had rushed away, cried, "God bless thee, invincible warrior! Savior who rescued us, with our children and houses, from ruin." The ancient, decrepit Butryms repeated in chorus, "God bless thee, God guide thee. Without thee this would have been the end of Valmontovichi." Ah, had they known in that crowd that the very same hand that had now saved the village from fire and the people from steel had 2 years before brought fire and the sword to that Valmontovichi. After the fire was quenched, all began to collect in Bilovica's wounded. The youths in a rage ran through the battlefield, and killed, with poles from wagon racks, the wounded left by the Swedes and Sienkiewicz ravagers. Olenka took command of the nursing. Ever keeping her presence of mind, full of energy and power, she did not cease her labor till every wounded man was resting in a cottage, with dressed wounds. Then all the people followed her example in repeating at the cross a litany for the dead. Through the whole night no one closed an eye in Valmontovichi. All were waiting for the return of the sword-bearer and Babinik, hurrying around at the same time to prepare for the victors a fitting reception. Oxen and sheep, herded in the forests, went under the knife, and fires were roaring till morning. Anusia alone could take no part in anything. For at first fear deprived her of power, and later her joy was so great that it had the seeming of madness. Olenka had to care for her. She was laughing and weeping in turn, and again she threw herself in the arms of her friend, repeating without system or order, "Well, what? Who saved Bilovic and the party and all Valmontovichi? Before whom did Sienkiewicz flee, who overwhelmed him, and the Swedes with him? Pan Babinik. Well, now. I knew he would come, for I wrote to him. But he did not forget. I knew he would come. It was I who brought him. Olenka, Olenka. I am happy. Have I not told you that no one could conquer him? Charniecki is not his equal. Oh my God, my God. Is it true that he will return? Will it be today? If he was not going to return, he would not have come, is it not true? Do you hear, Olenka? Horses are neighing in the distance. But in the distance nothing was neighing. Only toward morning a tramp was heard, shouting, singing, and Bilovic came back. The cavalry on foaming horses filled the whole village. There was no end to the songs, to the shouts, to the stories. The sword-bearer, covered with blood, panting, but joyful, related till sunrise how he had broken a body of the enemy's cavalry, how he had followed them 10 miles, and cut them almost to pieces. Billevik, as well as the troops and all the Luda people, were convinced that Babinik might return at any moment. The forenoon came. Then the sun went to the other half of the sky, and was descending, but Babinik came not. Anusia toward evening had sunburned spots on her face. If he cared only for the Swedes, and not for me, thought she, in her soul, still, he got the letter, for he came to the rescue. Poor woman! She knew not that the souls of Jurek Billevik and Braun were long since in the other world, and that Babinik had received no letter. For if he had received the letter he would have returned like a lightning flash to Valmontovici, but not for thee, Anusia. Another day passed. Billevik did not lose hope yet, and did not leave the village. Anusia held stubborn silence. He has belittled me terribly. But it is good for me, for my giddiness and my sins, said she to herself. On the third day Billevik sent some men on a reconnaissance. They returned 4 days later with information that Babinik had taken Ponyevyej, and spared not a Swede. Then he marched on, it was unknown whither, for tidings of him had ceased. I shall not find him till he comes up again, said Billevik. Anusia became a nettle. Whoever of the nobles or younger officers touched her drew back quickly. But the 5th day she said to Olenka, Pan Wołodyjowski is just as good a soldier, but less rude. And maybe, answered Olenka, meditatively, maybe Pan Babinik has retained his constancy for that other woman, of whom he spoke to you on the road from Zamost. Well, all one to me, said Anusia. But she told not the truth, for it was not all one to her yet, by any means. Chapter 95. Sakovich's forces were cut up to such a degree that he was barely able himself to take refuge in the forests near Ponyevyej with 4 other men. Then he wandered through the forests disguised as a peasant for a whole month, not daring to put his head out into the open light. But Babinik rushed upon Ponyevyej, cut down the infantry posted there as a garrison, and pursued Hamilton, who was unable to flee to Livonia because of the considerable Polish forces assembled in Shavli, and farther on, near Burgi, turned toward the east in hope of being able to break through to Vilkamir. He had doubts about saving his own regiment, but did not wish to fall into the hands of Babinik. For the report was spread everywhere that that stern warrior, not to burden himself, gave orders to slay every prisoner. The ill-fated Englishman therefore fled like a deer hunted by wolves, and Babinik hunted him all the more venomously. Hence he did not return to Valmontovici, and he did not even inquire what party it was that he had saved. The first hoarfrosts had begun to cover the earth in the morning. Escape became more difficult thereby, for the tracks of hoofs remained on the earth. In the forest there was no pasture, in the field the horses suffered stern hunger. The foreign cavalry did not dare to remain longer in villages, lest the stubborn enemy might reach them any moment. At last their misery surpassed all bounds. They lived only on leaves, bark, and those of their own horses which fell from fatigue. After a week they began to implore their colonel to turn, face Babinik, and give him battle, for they chose to die by the sword rather than by hunger. Hamilton yielded, and drew up for battle in Andronishki. The Swedish forces were inferior to that degree that the Englishman could not even think of victory, especially against such an opponent. But he was himself greatly wearied, and wanted to die. The battle, begun at Andronishki, ended near Truppi, where fell the last of the Swedes. Hamilton died the death of a hero, defending himself at a cross by the roadside against a number of Tartars, who wished at first to take him alive, but infuriated by his resistance bore him apart on their sabers at last. But Babinika's squadrons were so wearied too that they had neither the strength nor the wish to advance even to the neighboring Truppi. But wherever one of them stood during battle there it prepared at once for the night's rest, kindling fires in the midst of the enemy's corpses. After they had eaten, all fell asleep with the sleep of stones. Even the Tartars themselves deferred till next morning the plunder of corpses. Kmita, who was concerned mainly about the horses, did not oppose that rest. But next morning he rose rather early, so as to count his own loss after the stubborn conflict and divide the spoils justly. Immediately after eating he stood on the eminence, at that same cross under which Hamilton had died. The Polish and Tartar officers came to him in their turn, with the loss of their men notched on staffs, and made reports. He listened as a country proprietor listens in summer to his overseers, and rejoices in his heart at the plentiful harvest. Then Akba Ulan came up, more like a fright than a human being, for his nose had been broken at Valmontovichi by the hilt of a saber. He bowed, gave Kmita a bloody paper, and said, "Effendi, some papers were found on the Swedish leader, which I give according to order." Kmita had indeed given a rigorous order that all papers discovered on corpses should be brought to him straightway after battle, for often he was able to learn from them the plans of the enemy, and act accordingly. But at this time he was not so urgent, therefore he nodded and put the paper in his bosom. But Akba Ulan he sent to the Shambul with the order to move at once to Trupi, where they were to have a longer rest. The squadrons then passed before him, one after the other. In advance marched the Shambul, which now did not number 500 completely, the rest had been lost in continual battles. But each Tartar had so many Swedish Riksthalers, Prussian thalers and ducats sewed up in his saddle, in his coat, and in his cap, that he was worth his own weight. They were in no wise like common Tartars, for whoso of them was weaker had perished from hardship. There remained only men beyond praise, broad-shouldered, of iron endurance, and venomous as hornets. Continual practice had so trained them that in hand-to-hand conflict they could meet even the regular cavalry of Poland. On the heavy cavalry or dragoons of Prussia, when equal in number, they rushed like wolves upon sheep. In battle they defended with terrible fierceness the bodies of their comrades, so as to divide afterward their booty. They passed now before Kmita with great animation, sounding their trumpets, blowing their pipes, and shaking their horsetail standard. They went in such order that regular troops could not have marched better. Next came the dragoons, formed with great pains by Pan Andrei from volunteers of every description, armed with rapiers and muskets. They were led by the old sergeant, Soroka, now raised to the dignity of officer, and even to that of captain. The regiment, dressed in one fashion in captured uniforms taken from Prussian dragoons, was composed chiefly of men of low station. But Kmita loved specially that kind of people, for they obeyed blindly and endured every toil without uttering a murmur. In the two following squadrons of volunteers only smaller and higher nobles served. They were stormy spirits and restive, who under another leader would have been turned into a herd of robbers, but in Kmita's iron hands they had become like regular squadrons, and gladly called themselves light horsemen. These were less steady under fire than the dragoons, but were more terrible in their first fury, and were more skillful in hand-to-hand conflict, for they knew every point of fencing. After these marched, finally, about 1,000 fresh volunteers, good men, but over whom it was needful to work yet to make them like regular troops. Each of these squadrons in passing raised a shout, saluting meanwhile Pan Andrei with their sabers. And he was more and more rejoiced. That was a considerable and not a poor force. He had accomplished much with it, had shed much of the enemy's blood, and God knows how much he might do yet. His former offenses were great, but his recent services were not slight. He had risen from his fall, from his sin, and had gone to repent, not in the church, but in the field, not in ashes, but in blood. He had defended the most holy lady, the country, and the king. And now he felt that it was easier in his soul and more joyous. Nay, the heart of the young man swelled with pride, for not everyone would have been able to make head as he had. For how many fiery nobles are there, how many cavaliers in that commonwealth? And why does no one of them stand at the head of such forces, not even Wołodyjowski, nor Pan Yen? Besides, who defended Częstochowa, who defended the king in the pass, who slashed down Boguslav, who first brought fire and sword into electoral Prussia? And behold, even now in Jmud there is hardly an enemy. Here Pan Andrei felt what the falcon feels, when, stretching his wings, he rises higher and higher. The passing squadrons greeted him with a thundering shout, and he raised his head and asked himself, "Whither shall I fly?" And his face flushed, for in that moment it seemed to him that within himself he bore a hetman. But that baton, if it comes to him, will come from the field, from wounds, from service, from praise. No traitor will flash it before his eyes as in his time Prince Yanush had done, but a thankful country will place it in his hand, with the will of the king. But it is not for him to think when it will come, but to fight, and to fight tomorrow as he fought yesterday. Here the excited imagination of the cavalier returned to reality. Whither should he march from Truppy, in what new place strike the Swedes? Then he remembered the letter given him by Akba Ulan and found on the body of Hamilton. He put his hand in his bosom, took it out and looked, and astonishment at once was reflected on his face. For on the letter was written plainly, in a woman's hand, to His Grace Pan Babinik, Colonel of Tartar Forces and Volunteers. "For me," said Pan Andrei. The seal was broken. Therefore he opened the letter quickly, struck the paper with the back of his hand, and began to read. But he had not finished when his hands began to quiver, his face changed, and he cried, "Praised be the name of the Lord! O merciful God, the reward comes to me from thy hand." Here he seized the foot of the cross with both hands, and began to beat his yellow hair against the wood. In another manner he was not able to thank God at that moment. He found no other words for prayer, because delight like a whirlwind had seized him and borne him far, far away to the sky. That letter was from Anusia. The Swedes had found it on the body of Jurek Bilovic, and now it had come to Kmita's hands through a second corpse. Through Pan Andrei's head thousands of thoughts were flying with the speed of Tartar arrows. Therefore Olenka was not in the wilderness, but in Bilovica's party. And he had just saved her, and with her that Valmontovici which on a time he had sent up in smoke in avenging his comrades. Evidently the hand of God had directed his steps, so that with one blow he had made good all wrongs done Olenka and Leuda. Behold, his offences are washed away. Can she refuse now to forgive him, or can that grave brotherhood of Leuda? Can they refuse to bless him? And what will she say, that beloved maiden who holds him a traitor, when she learns that Babinik who brought down Radziwill, who waded to his girdle in German and Swedish blood, who crushed the enemy out of Jmud, destroyed them, drove them to Prussia and Livonia, was Kmita. No longer, however, the disorderly, the outlaw, the traitor, but the defender of the faith, of the king, of the country? Immediately after he had crossed the boundary of Jmud, Pan Andrei wished to proclaim to the four sides of the world who that far-famed Babinik was. And if he did not do so, it was only because he feared that at the very sound of his real name all would turn from him, all would suspect him, would refuse him aid and confidence. 2 years had barely passed, since bewildered by Radziwill he had cut down those squadrons which were not willing to rise with Radziwill against king and country. Barely 2 years before, he had been the right hand of the traitor. Now all was changed. Now, after so many victories, in such glory, he had a right to come to the maiden and say, "I am Kmita, but your savior." He had a right to shout to all Jmud, "I am Kmita, but thy savior." Besides, Valmontovici was not distant. Kmita had followed Hamilton a week, but Kmita would be at the feet of Olenka in less time than a week. Here Pan Andrei stood up, pale with emotion, with flaming eyes, with gleaming face, and cried to his attendant, "My horse quickly! Be alive, be alive!" The attendant brought the black steed, and sprang down to hold the stirrup. But when he had reached the ground he said, "Your Grace, some strange men are approaching from Truppy with Pan Soroka, and they are coming at a trot." "I do not care for them," answered Pan Andrei. Now both horsemen approached to within some yards. Then one of them with Soroka pushed forward on a gallop, arrived, and removing his panther skin cap, uncovered a head red as fire. "I see that I am standing before Pan Babinik," said he. "I am glad that I have found you." "With whom have I the honor to speak?" asked Kmita, impatiently. "I am Vyershul, once captain of the Tartar squadron with Prince Yeremy Vishniovetzky. I come to my native place to make levies for a new war, and besides I bring you a letter from the Grand Hetman, Sapieha." "For a new war?" asked Kmita, frowning. "What do you say?" "This letter will explain better than I," replied Vyershul, giving the letter of the hetman. Kmita opened the letter feverishly. It read as follows. "My very dear Pan Babinik, a new deluge is on the country. A league of Sweden with XCII has been concluded, and a division of the Commonwealth agreed upon. 80,000 Hungarians, Transylvanians, Wallachians, and Cossacks may cross the southern boundary at any moment. And since in these last straits it is necessary for us to exert all our forces so as to leave even a glorious name after our people for coming ages, I send to your grace this order. According to which you are to turn straight to the south without losing a moment of time, and come to us by forced marches. You will find us in Brest, whence we will send you farther without delay. This time periculum in Mora, there is danger in delay. Prince Boguslav is freed from captivity. But Pan Gosiewski is to have an eye on Prussia and Jmud. Enjoining haste on you once more, I trust that love for the perishing country will be your best spur." When Kmita had finished reading, he dropped the letter to the earth, and began to pass his hands over his moistened face. At last he looked wonderingly on Vyershul, and inquired in a low, stifled voice. "Why is Pan Gosiewski to remain in Jmud, and why must I go to the south?" Vyershul shrugged his shoulders. "Ask the hetman in Brest for his reason, I answer nothing." All at once terrible anger seized Pan Andrei by the throat. His eyes flashed, his face was blue, and he cried with a shrieking voice, "I will not go from here. Do you understand?" "Is that true?" asked Vyershul. "My office was to deliver the order. The rest is your affair." "With the forehead, with the forehead. I wish to beg your company for a couple of hours, but after what I have heard I prefer to look for another." Then he wheeled his horse and rode off. Pan Andrei sat again under the cross, and began to look around on the sky, as if wishing to take note of the weather. The attendant drew back some distance with the horses, and stillness set in all around. The morning was clear, pale, half autumnal, half wintry. The wind was not blowing, but from the birch bushes growing at the foot of the crucifix the last leaves were dropping noiselessly, yellow and shriveled from frost. Countless flocks of crows and jackdaws were flying over the forest. Some were letting themselves down with mighty cawing right there near the crucifix, for the field and the road were covered with corpses of Swedes still unburied. Pan Andrei looked at those dark birds, blinking his eyes. You would say that he wanted to count them. Then he closed his lids and sat long without motion. At last he shuddered, frowned. Presence of mind came back to his face, and he began to speak thus to himself. "It cannot be otherwise. I will go in 2 weeks, but not now. Let happen what may. It was not I who brought XCII. I cannot. What is too much is too much. Have I hammered and pounded but little, passed sleepless nights in the saddle, shed my own blood and that of other men? What reward for this? If I had not received the first letter, should have gone, but both have come in 1 hour, as if for the greater pain, the greater sorrow. Let the world perish, I will not go. The country will not be lost in 2 weeks, and besides the anger of God is evidently on it, and it is not in the might of man to oppose that. O God! The Hyperboreans, Northern Russians, the Swedes, the Prussians, the Hungarians, the Transylvanians, the Wallachians, the Cossacks, and all of them at once. Who can resist? O Lord, in what has this unfortunate land offended, in what this pious king, that thou hast turned from them thy face, and givest neither mercy nor rescue, and sendest new lashes? Is the bloodshed yet too little, the tears too few? People here have forgotten to rejoice, so the wind does not blow here, it groans. So the rains do not fall, they weep, and thou art lashing and lashing. Mercy, O Lord! Salvation, O Father! We have sinned, but still repentance has come. We have yielded our fortunes, we have mounted our horses, we are fighting and fighting. We have abandoned violence, we have abjured private ends. Why not pardon us? Why not comfort us? Here conscience seized him by the hair suddenly, and shook him till he screamed. For at the same time it seemed to him that he heard some strange voice from the whole dome of heaven, saying, "Have you abandoned private ends? But, unfortunate, what are you doing at this moment? You are exalting your services, and when the first moment of trial comes, you rise like a wild horse, and shout, 'I will not go. The mother is perishing. New swords are piercing her breast, and you turn away from her. You do not wish to support her with your arm, you are running after your own fortune, and crying, I will not go. She is stretching forth bleeding hands, she is just falling, just fainting, just dying, and with her last voice cries, Rescue me, children. But you answer, I will not go. Woe to you! Woe to such people, woe to the Commonwealth!" Here terror raised the hair on Pan Andrei's head, and his whole body began to tremble as if fever had seized it. And that moment he fell with his face to the earth, and began not to cry, but to scream in terror. "O Jesus, do not punish. Jesus, have mercy. Thy will be done. I will go, I will go." Then he lay some time without speaking, and sobbed, and when he rose at last, he had a face full of resignation and perfectly calm. And thus he prayed further. "Wonder not, O Lord, that I grieve, for I was on the eve of my happiness, but let it be as thou hast ordained. I understand now that thou didst wish to try me, and therefore didst place me as it were on the parting of the roads. Let thy will be done. Once more I will not look behind. To thee, O Lord, I offer this my terrible sorrow, this my yearning, this my grievous suffering. Let it all be accounted to me in punishment because I spared Prince Boguslav, at which the country wept. Thou sayest now, O Lord, that that was my last work for self-interest. There will be no other. O merciful Father! But now I will kiss once more this beloved earth, yes, I will press thy bleeding feet again, and I go, O Christ. I go." And he went. In the heavenly register in which are written the evil and good deeds of men, his sins were at that moment all blotted out, for he was completely corrected. Chapter 96. It is written in no book how many battles the armies, the nobles, and the people of the Commonwealth fought with the enemy. They fought in forests, in fields, in villages, in hamlets, in towns, they fought in Prussia, in Mazovia, in Great Poland, in Little Poland, in Russia, in Lithuania, in Jmud. They fought without resting, in the day or the night. Every clod of earth was drenched in blood. The names of knights, their glorious deeds, their great devotion, perished from the memory. For the chronicler did not write them down, and the lute did not celebrate them. But under the force of these exertions the power of the enemy bent at last. And as when a lordly lion, pierced the moment before with missiles, rises suddenly, and shaking his kingly mane, roars mightily, pale terror pierces straightway the hunters. And their feet turn to flight. So that Commonwealth rose ever more terrible, filled with anger of Jove, ready to meet the whole world. Into the bones of the aggressors there entered weakness and fear. Not of plunder were they thinking then, but of this only, to bear away home from the jaws of the lion sound heads. New leagues, new legions of Hungarians, Transylvanians, Wallachians, and Cossacks were of no avail. The storm passed once more, it is true, between Brest, Warsaw, and Krakow. But it was broken against Polish breasts, and soon was scattered like empty vapor. The King of Sweden, being the first to despair of his cause, went home to the Danish war. The traitorous Elector, humble before the strong, insolent to the weak, beat with his forehead before the Commonwealth, and fell upon the Swedes. The robber legions of Rakoczy's slaughterers fled with all power to their Transylvanian reed fields, which Pan Lubomirski ruined with fire and sword. But it was easier for them to break into the Commonwealth than to escape without punishment. Therefore when they were attacked at the passage, the counts of Transylvania, kneeling before Potocki, Lubomirski, and Czarniecki, begged for mercy in the dust. "We will surrender our weapons, we will give millions," cried they, "only let us go." And receiving the ransom, the hetmans took pity on that army of unfortunate men. But the horde trampled them under hoofs at the very thresholds of their homes. Peace began to return gradually to the plains of Poland. The king was still taking Prussian fortresses. Czarniecki was to take the Polish sword to Denmark, for the Commonwealth did not wish to limit itself to driving out the enemy. Villages and towns were rebuilt on burned ruins. The people returned from the forests, plows appeared in the fields. In the autumn of 1657, immediately after the Hungarian War, it was quiet in the greater part of the provinces and districts. It was quiet especially in Jmud. Those of the Luda men who in their time had gone with Wołodyjowski, were still somewhere far off in the field, but their return was expected. Meanwhile in Maryzy, in Valmontovichi, in Drodzikani, Mocki, Goszczuni, and Patsanelli, women, boys, and girls, with old men, were sowing the winter grain. Building with joint efforts houses in those neighborhoods through which fire had passed, so that the warriors on their return might find at least roofs over their heads, and not be forced to die of hunger. Olenka had been living for some time at Vodokty, with Anusia and the sword-bearer. Pan Tomasz did not hasten to his Bilowish, first, because it was burned, and second, because it was pleasanter for him with the maidens than alone. Meanwhile, with the aid of Olenka, he managed Vodokty. The lady wished to manage Vodokty in the best manner, for it was to be with Mitrany her dowry for the cloister. In other words, it was to become the property of the Benedictine nuns, with whom on the very day of the coming new year poor Olenka intended to begin her novitiate. For after she had considered everything that had met her, those changes of fortune, disappointments, and sufferings, she came to the conviction that thus, and not otherwise, must be the will of God. It seemed to her that some all-powerful hand was urging her to the cell, that some voice was saying to her, "In that place is the best pacification, and the end of all earthly anxiety." She had determined therefore to follow that voice. Feeling, however, in the depth of her conscience that her soul had not been able yet to tear itself from the earth with completeness, she desired first to prepare it with ardent piety, with good works and labor. Frequently also in those efforts echoes from the world hindered her. For example, people began to buzz around at that famous Babinnik was Kmita. Some contradicted excitedly. Others repeated the statement with stubbornness. Olenka believed not. All Kmita's deeds, Kmita and his service with Janusz Radziwill, were too vividly present in her memory to let her suppose for one instant that he was the crusher of Boguslav. And such a trusty worker for the king, such an ardent patriot. Still her peace was disturbed, and sorrow with pain rose up afresh in her bosom. This might be remedied by a hurried entrance to the cloister, but the cloisters were scattered. The nuns who had not perished from the violence of soldiers during wartime were only beginning to assemble. Universal misery reigned in the land, and whoso wished to take refuge behind the walls of a convent had not only to bring bread for personal use, but also to feed the whole convent. Olenka wished to come with bread to the cloister, to become not merely a sister, but a nourisher of nuns. The sword-bearer, knowing that his labor was to go to the glory of God, labored earnestly. He went around the fields and the buildings, carrying out the labors of the autumn which with the coming spring were to bear fruit. Sometimes he was accompanied by Anusia, who, unable to endure the affront which Babinnik had put upon her, threatened also to enter the cloister, and said she was merely waiting for Wołodyjowski to bring back the Luda men, for she wished to bid adieu to her old friend. But more frequently the sword-bearer went with Olenka only on these circuits, for land management was irksome to Anusia. A certain time both rode out on ponies to Mitrany, where they were rebuilding barns and cowhouses burned in time of war. On the road they were to visit the church. For that was the anniversary of the Battle of Valmontovichi, in which they were saved from the last straits by the coming of Babinik. The whole day had passed for them in various occupations, so that only toward evening could they start from Mitrany. In going there they went by the church road, but in returning they had to pass through Lubick and Valmontovichi. Panna Alexandra had barely looked at the first smoke of Lubick when she turned aside her eyes and began to repeat prayers to drive away painful thoughts. But the sword-bearer rode on in silence, and only looked around. At last, when they had passed the gate, he said, "That is land for a senator. Lubick is worth 2 like Mitrany." Olenka continued to say her prayers. But in Pan Tomasz was roused the old landlord by nature, and perhaps also he was given somewhat to lawsuits. For after a while he said again, as if to himself, "And yet it is ours by right, old Bilovic property, our sweat, our toil. That unfortunate man must have perished long since, for he has not announced himself, and if he had, the right is with us." Here he turned to Olenka. "What do you think?" "That is a cursed place," answered she. "Let happen with it what may. But you see the right is with us. The place was cursed in bad hands, but it will be blessed in good ones. The right is with us. Never. I do not wish to know anything of it. My grandfather willed it without restriction, let Kmita's relatives take it." Then she urged on the pony. Bilovic put spurs also to his beast, and they did not slacken speed till they were in the open field. Meanwhile night had fallen. But there was perfect light, for an enormous red moon had risen from behind the forest of Valmontovichi and lighted up the whole region with a golden shining. "Well, God has given a beautiful night," said the sword-bearer, looking at the circle of the moon. "How Valmontovichi gleams from a distance," said Olenka. "For the wood in the houses has not become black." Their further conversation was interrupted by the squeaking of a wagon, which they could not see at first, for the road was undulating. Soon, however, they saw a pair of horses, and following behind them a pair at a pole, and at the end of the pole a wagon surrounded by a number of horsemen. "What kind of people can these be?" asked the sword-bearer, and he held in his horse. Olenka stopped at his side. "Halt!" cried Bilovic. "Whom are you carrying there?" One of the horsemen turned to them and said, "We are bringing Pan Kmita, who was shot by the Hungarians at Magyarovo." "The word has become flesh," said Bilovic. The whole world went around suddenly in Olenka's eyes, the heart died within her, breath failed her breast. Certain voices were calling in her soul, "Jesus! Mary! That is he!" Then consciousness of where she was or what was happening left her entirely. But she did not drop from the horse to the ground, for she seized convulsively with her hand the wagon rack. And when she came to herself her eyes fell on the motionless form of a man lying in the wagon. True, that was he, Pan Andrei Kmita, the banneret of Orsha, and he was lying on his back in the wagon. His head was bound in a cloth, but by the ruddy light of the moon his pale and calm face was perfectly visible. His eyes were deeply sunk and closed. Life did not discover itself by the least movement. "With God," said Bilovic, removing his cap. "Stop," cried Olenka. And she asked with a low but quick voice, as in a fever, "Is he alive or dead?" "He is alive, but death is over him." Here the sword-bearer, looking at Kmita's face, said, "You will not take him to Lubick?" "He gave orders to take him to Lubick without fail, for he wants to die there." "With God. Hasten forward. We beat with the forehead." The wagon moved on, and Olenka with Bilovic galloped in the opposite direction with what breath was in their horses. They flew through Valmontovichi like two night phantoms, and came to Vodokty without speaking a word on the road. Only when dismounting, Olenka turned to her uncle. "It is necessary to send a priest to him," said she, with a panting voice. "Let someone go this moment to Upita." The sword-bearer went quickly to carry out her wish. She rushed into her room, and threw herself on her knees before the image of the Most Holy Lady. A couple of hours after, in the late evening, a bell was heard beyond the gate at Vodokty. That was the priest passing on his way with the Lord Jesus to Lubbock. Panna Alexandra was on her knees continually. Her lips were repeating the litany for the dying. And when she had finished she struck the floor 3 times with her head, repeating, "Reckon to him, O God, that he dies at the hands of the enemy, forgive him, have mercy on him." In this way the whole night passed for her. The priest remained in Lubbock till morning, and on his way home called at Vodokty. Olenka ran out to meet him. "Is it all over?" asked she. And could say no more, for breath failed her. "He is alive yet," answered the priest. During each of the following days a number of messengers flew from Vodokty to Lubbock, and each returned with the answer that the banneret was alive yet. At last one brought the intelligence, which he had heard from the barber brought from Kyedani, that he was not only alive, but would recover. For the wounds were healing successfully, and strength was coming back to the knight. Panna Alexandra sent bountiful offerings to Upita for a Thanksgiving Mass. But from that day messengers ceased to visit Lubbock, and a wonderful thing took place in the maiden's heart. Together with peace, the former pity for Kmita began to rise. His offences came to her mind again every moment, so grievous that they were not to be forgiven. Death alone could cover them with oblivion. If he returned to health, they weighed on him anew. But still everything that could be brought to his defense Olenka repeated to herself daily. So much had she suffered in these days, so many conflicts were there in her soul, that she began to fail in health. This disturbed Pan Tomasz greatly. Hence on a certain evening when they were alone, he said, "Olenka, tell me sincerely, what do you think of the banneret of Orsha? It is known to God that I do not wish to think of him. For see, you have grown thin, Maybe that you still, I insist on nothing, but I should be glad to know what is going on in your mind. Do you not think that the will of your grandfather should be accomplished?" "Never," answered Olenka. "My grandfather left me this door open, and I will knock at it on the new year. Thus will his will be accomplished." "Neither do I believe at all," answered Bilevich, "what some buzz around here, that Babinik and Kmita are one. But still at Magyarovo he was with the country, fought against the enemy, and shed his blood. The reform is late, but still it is a reform." "Even Prince Boguslav is serving the king and the country now," answered the lady, with sorrow. "Let God forgive both, and especially him who shed his blood. But people will always have the right to say that in the moment of greatest misfortune, in the moment of disaster and fall, he rose against the country. And returned to it only when the enemy's foot was tottering, and when his personal profit commanded him to hold to the victor. That is their sin. Now there are no traitors, for there is no profit from treason. But what is the merit? Is it not a new proof that such men are always ready to serve the stronger? Would to God it were otherwise, but Magyarovo cannot redeem such transgression." "It is true. I cannot deny it," answered Bilevich. "It is a bitter truth, but still true. All the former traitors have gone over in a shambull to the king. On the banneret of Orsha," continued the lady, "there rests a still more grievous reproach than on Boguslav, for Pan Kmita offered to raise his hand against the king. At which act the prince himself was terrified. Can a chance shot remove that? I would let this hand be cut off had that not happened, but it has, and it will never drop away. It seems clear that God has left him life of purpose for penance. My uncle, my uncle. We should be tempting our souls if we tried to beat into ourselves that he is innocent. And what good would come of this? Will conscience let itself be tempted? Let the will of God be done. What is broken cannot be bound again, and should not. I am happy that the banneret is alive, I confess. For it is evident that God has not yet turned from him his favor altogether. But that is sufficient for me. I shall be happy when I hear that he has effaced his fault. But I wish for nothing more, I desire nothing more, even if my soul had to suffer yet. May God assist him." Olenka was not able to speak longer, for a great and pitiful weeping overpowered her. But that was her last weeping. She had told all that she carried in her heart, and from that time forth peace began to return to her anew. Chapter 97. The horned, daring soul in truth was unwilling to go out of its bodily enclosure, and did not go out. In a month after his return to Lubbock, Pan Andrei's wounds began to heal. But still earlier he regained consciousness, and looking around the room, he saw at once where he was. Then he called the faithful Soroka. "Soroka," said he, "the mercy of God is upon me. I feel that I shall not die." "According to order," answered the old soldier, brushing away a tear with his fist. And Kmita continued as if to himself, "The penance is over, I see that clearly. The mercy of God is upon me." Then he was silent for a moment, only his lips were moving in prayer. "Soroka," said he again, after a time. "At the service of your grace." "Who are in Vodokty?" "The lady and the sword-bearer of Rosieni." "Praised be the name of the Lord. Did anyone come here to inquire about me?" "They sent from Vodokty until we told them that you would be well." "And did they stop then?" "Then they stopped." "They know nothing yet, but they shall know from me," said Kmita. "Did you tell no one that I fought as Babinik?" "There was no order," answered the soldier. "And the Luda men with Pan Wołodyjowski have not come home yet?" "Not yet, but they may come any day." With this the conversation of the first day was at an end. 2 weeks later Kmita had risen and was walking on crutches. The following week he insisted on going to church. "We will go to Upita," said he to Soroka, "for it is needful to begin with God, and after Mass we will go to Vodokty." Soroka did not dare to oppose. Therefore he merely ordered straw to be placed in the wagon. Pan Andrei arrayed himself in holiday costume, and they drove away. They arrived at an hour when there were few people yet in the church. Pan Andrei, leaning on Soroka's arm, went to the high altar itself, and knelt in the collator's seat. His face was very thin, emaciated, and besides he wore a long beard which had grown during the war and his sickness. Whoever looked at him thought that he was some passing personage who had come in to Mass. For there was movement everywhere, the country was full of passing nobles who were going from the field to their own estates. The church filled slowly with people and with neighboring nobles. Then owners of inherited land from a distance began to arrive, for in many places churches had been burned, and it was necessary to come to Mass as far as Upita. Kmita, sunk in prayer, saw no one. He was roused first from his pious meditation by the squeaking of footstools under the tread of persons entering the pew. Then he raised his head, looked, and saw right there above him the sweet, sad face of Olenka. She also saw him, and recognized him that moment, for she drew back suddenly, as if frightened. First a flush, and then a deathly pallor came out on her face, but with the greatest exercise of will she overcame her emotion, and knelt there near him. The third place was occupied by the sword-bearer. And Kmita and she bowed their heads, and rested their faces on their hands. They knelt there in silence side by side, and their hearts beat so that both heard them perfectly. At last Pan Andrei spoke. "May Jesus Christ be praised." "For the ages of ages," answered Olenka, in an undertone. And they said no more. Now the priest came out to preach. Kmita listened to him. But in spite of his efforts he could not distinguish the words, he could not understand the preacher. Here she is, the desired one, for whom he had yearned during years, who had not left his mind nor his heart, she was here now at his side. He felt her near. And he dared not turn his eyes to her, for he was in the church, but closing his lids, he caught her breathing with his ear. "Olenka! Olenka is near me," said he to himself. "See, God has commanded us to meet in the church after absence." Then his thoughts and his heart repeated without ceasing, "Olenka, Olenka, Olenka." And at moments a weeping joy caught him by the throat, and again he was carried away by such an enthusiasm of thankful prayer that he lost consciousness of what was happening to him. She knelt continually, with her face hidden in her hands. The priest had finished the sermon, and descended from the pulpit. All at once a clatter of arms was heard in front of the church, and a tramp of horses' hoofs. Someone cried before the threshold of the church, "Leuda returning." And suddenly in the sanctuary itself were heard murmurs, then a bustle, then a still louder calling. "Leuda! Leuda!" The crowd began to sway, all heads were turned at once toward the door. With that there was a throng in the door, and a body of armed men appeared in the church. At the head of them marched with a clatter of spurs Wołodyjowski and Zagloba. The crowd opened before them. They passed through the whole church, knelt before the altar, prayed a short time, and then entered the vestry. The Leuda men halted halfway, not greeting anyone, out of respect for the place. Ah, what a sight! Grim faces, swarthy from winds, grown thin from toils of war, cut with sabers of Swedes, Germans, Hungarians, and Wallachians. The whole history of the war and the glory of God-fearing Leuda was written on them with swords. There were the gloomy Butryms, the Stockians, the Domasheviches, the Gostsiewiches, a few of all. But hardly 1/4 returned of those who on a time had left Leuda. Many women are seeking in vain for their husbands, many old men are searching in vain for their sons. Therefore the weeping increases, for those too who find their own are weeping from joy. The whole church is filled with sobbing. From time to time someone cries out a beloved name, and is silent. And they stand in glory, leaning on their sabers, but over their deep scars tears too are falling on their mustaches. Now a bell, rung at the door of the vestry, quieted the weeping and the murmur. All knelt, the priest came to finish mass, and after him Wołodyjowski and Zagloba. But the priest was so moved that when he turned to the people, saying, "Dominus vobiscum," his voice trembled. When he came to the gospel, and all the sabers were drawn at once from the scabbards, as a sign that Leuda was ever ready to defend the faith, and in the church it was bright from steel. The priest had barely strength to finish the gospel. Then amid universal emotion the concluding prayer was sung, and mass was ended. But the priest, when he had placed the sacrament in the tabernacle, turned, after the last gospel, to the people, in sign that he wished to say something. There was silence, therefore, and the priest with cordial words greeted first the returning soldiers. Then he gave notice that he would read a letter from the king, brought by the colonel of the Leuda squadron. The silence grew deeper, and after a while the voice from the altar was heard through the whole church. "We, Yen Casimir, King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, Mazovia, Prussia, etc., etc., etc. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, Amen. Since wicked people must receive punishment in this temporal life for their crimes against king and country before they stand in presence of the heavenly tribunal, it is equally just that virtue receive a reward, which should add the luster of glory to virtue itself, and give posterity the desire to follow its examples. Therefore we make it known to the whole order of knighthood, namely, to men of arms and civilians having office, together with all the inhabitants of the Grand Principality of Lithuania and our starostaship of Chmud, that whatever accusations have rested on Pan Andrei Kmita, the banneret of Orsha, who is greatly beloved by us, are to vanish from the memory of men, in view of the following services and merit, and are to detract in no wise from the honor and glory of the said banneret of Orsha. Here the priest ceased to read, and looked toward the bench on which Pan Andrei was sitting. Kmita rose for a moment, and sitting down again, rested his haggard head on the railing and closed his lids, as if in a faint. But all eyes were turned to him. All lips began to whisper, "Pan Kmita! Kmita! There, near the Biloviks." But the priest beckoned, and began to read on amid deep silence. "Which banneret of Orsha?" Though in the beginning of this unfortunate Swedish invasion he declared himself on the side of the Prince Voivoda, did it not from any selfishness, but from the purest goodwill to the country. Brought to this error by Prince Janusz Radziwill, who persuaded him that no road of safety remained to the Commonwealth save that which the prince himself took. But when he visited Prince Boguslav, who, thinking him a traitor, discovered to him clearly all the hostile intrigues against the country, the said Banneret of Orsha not only did not promise to raise his hand against our person, but with armed force carried away Prince Boguslav himself, so as to avenge us and the suffering country. "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner," cried the voice of a woman right there near Pan Andrei, and in the church there broke out anew a murmur of amazement. The priest read on. He was shot by Boguslav, but had barely recovered when he went to Chenstohova, and there defended with his own breast that most sacred retreat, giving an example of endurance and valor to all. There, in danger of his life and health, he blew up with powder the greatest siege gun. Seized after that daring deed, he was condemned to death by cruel enemies, and tortured with living fire. With this the weeping of women was heard here and there through the church. Olenka was trembling as in a paroxysm of fever. But rescued by the power of the Queen of the Angels from those terrible straits, he came to us in Silesia, and on our return to this dear country, when the treacherous enemy prepared an ambush for us, the said Banneret of Orsha rushed himself, with his 3 attendants, on the whole power of the enemy, to save our person. There, cut down and thrust through with rapiers, swimming in his own blood, he was borne from the field as if lifeless. Olenka placed both her hands on her temples, and raising her head, began to catch the air into her parted lips. From her bosom came out the groan, "O God! O God! O God!" And again the voice of the priest sounded, also more and more moved. And when with our endeavors he returned to health, he did not rest, but continued the war, standing forth with immeasurable praise in every necessity, held up as a model to knighthood by the hetmans of both people, till the fortunate capture of Warsaw. After which he was sent to Prussia under the assumed name of Babinik. When that name was heard in the church, the noise of the people changed as it were into the roar of a river. Then he is Babinik? Then he is that crusher of the Swedes, the savior of Valmontovichi, the victor in so many battles, that is Kmita? The murmur increased still more. Throngs began to push toward the altar to see him more closely. "God bless him! God bless him," said hundreds of voices. The priest turned to the seat and blessed Pan Andrei, who, leaning continually against the railing, was more like a dead than a living man. For the soul had gone out of him with happiness and had risen toward the sky. The priest read on. He visited the enemy's country with fire and sword, was the main cause of the victory at Prostki, with his own hand he overthrew and captured Prince Boguslav. Called late to our starostaship of Jmud, what immense service he rendered there, how many towns and villages he saved from the hands of the enemy, must be known to the inhabitants of that starostaship better than to others. "It is known, it is known, it is known," was thundered through the whole church. "Silence," said the priest, raising the king's letter. "Therefore we, considering all his services to us and the country, so many that a son could not have done more for his father and his mother, have determined to publish them in this our letter. So that so great a cavalier, so great a defender of the faith, of king and commonwealth, should no longer be pursued by the ill will of men, but go clothed with the praise and universal love proper to the virtuous. Before then the next diet, confirming these our wishes, shall remove from him every stain, and before we shall reward him with the starostaship of Upita, which is vacant. We ask earnestly of the inhabitants dear to us of our starostaship of Jmud to retain in their hearts and thoughts these our words, which justice itself, the foundation of states, has commanded us to put into their memory." Here the priest concluded, and turning to the altar began to pray, but Pan Andrei felt on a sudden that a soft hand was seizing his hand. He looked. It was Olenka. And before he had time to come to himself, to withdraw his hand, she had raised it and pressed it to her lips in presence of all, before the altar and the people. "Olenka!" cried the astonished Kmita. But she had arisen, and covering her face with a veil, said to old Bilovic, "Uncle, let us go from here quickly." And they went out through the door of the vestry. Pan Andrei tried to rise to follow her, but he could not. His strength left him entirely. But a quarter of an hour later he was in front of the church, supported on one side by Pan Wołodyjowski, on the other by Zagloba. The throng of people, small nobles and common men, crowded around. Women, some barely able to tear away from the breast of a husband returned from the war, led by curiosity special to the sex, ran to look at that Kmita, once terrible. Now the savior of Luda and the coming Starosta. The throng became greater every instant, till the Luda men had at last to surround him and protect him from the crush. "Pan Andrei," cried Zagloba, "see, we have brought you a present. You did not expect such a one. Now to Vodokty, to the betrothal and the wedding." Further words of Zagloba were lost in the thundering shout raised at once by the Luda men, under the leadership of Yuzva Footless. "Long life to Pan Kmita!" "Long life," repeated the crowd. "Long life to our Starosta of Upita!" "Long life!" "All to Vodokty," roared Zagloba, again. "To Vodokty! To Vodokty!" shouted 1,000 throats. As best men to Vodokty with Pan Kmita, with our savior. "To the lady! To Vodokty!" And an immense movement began. Luda mounted its horses, every man living rushed to wagons, carts, ponies. People on foot began to run across field and forest. The shout, "To Vodokty," rang through the whole place. The roads were thronged with many-colored crowds. Kmita rode in his little wagon between Wołodyjowski and Zagloba, and time after time he embraced one or the other of them. He was not able to speak yet, he was too much excited. But they pushed on as if Tartars were attacking Upita. All the wagons and carts rushed in like manner around them. They were well outside the place, when Pan Michael suddenly bent to Kmita's ear. "Jędrek," asked he, "but do you not know where the other is?" "In Vodokty." Then, whether it was the wind or excitement that began to move the mustaches of Pan Michael, is unknown. It is enough that during the whole way they did not cease to thrust forward like two awls, or like the feelers of a May-bug. Zagloba was singing with delight in such a terrible bass voice that he frightened the horses. "There were two of us, Kasienko, two in this world. But methinks, somehow, that three are now riding." Anusia was not at church that Sunday, for she had in her turn to stay with the weekly Panna Kulvyets, with whom she and Olenka remained on alternate days. The whole morning she had been occupied with watching and taking care of the sick woman, so that it was late when she could go to her prayers. Barely had she said the last Amen, when there was a thundering before the gate, and Olenka rushed into the room like a storm. "Jesus! Mary! What has happened?" screamed Anusia, looking at her. "Anusia, you do not know who Pan Babinik is? He is Pan Kmita." Anusia sprang to her feet. "Who told you?" "The king's letter was read, Pan Wołodyjowski brought it, the Luda men." "Has Pan Wołodyjowski returned?" screamed Anusia, and she threw herself into Olenka's arms. Olenka took this outburst of feeling as a proof of Anusia's love for her, for she had become feverish, was almost unconscious. On her face were fiery spots, and her breast rose and fell as if from great pain. Then Olenka began to tell without order and in a broken voice everything which she had heard in the church, running at the same time through the room as if demented, repeating every moment, "I am not worthy of him," reproaching herself terribly, saying that she had done him more injustice than all others, that she had not even been willing to pray for him, when he was swimming in his own blood in defense of the Holy Lady, the country, and the king. In vain did Anusia, while running after her through the room, endeavor to comfort her. She repeated continually one thing, that she was not worthy of him, that she would not dare to look in his eyes. Then again she would begin to speak of the deeds of Babinik, of the seizure of Boguslav, of his revenge, of saving the king, of Prostki, Valmontovichi, and Chenstohova. And at last of her own faults, of her stubbornness, for which she must do penance in the cloister. Further reproaches were interrupted by Pan Tomasz, who, falling into the room like a bomb, cried, "In God's name, all Upita is rolling after us. They are already in the village, and Babinik is surely with them." Indeed, a distant shout at that moment announced the approach of the crowds. The sword-bearer, seizing Olenka, conducted her to the porch. Anusia rushed after them. At that moment the throng of men and horses looked black in the distance. And as far as the eye could reach the whole road was packed with them. At last they reached the yard. Those on foot were storming over ditches and fences. The wagons rolled in through the gates, and all were shouting and throwing up their caps. At last appeared the crowd of armed Luda men, and the wagon, in which sat 3 persons, Kmita, Wołodyjowski, and Zagloba. The wagon stopped at some distance, for so many people had crowded up before the entrance that it was impossible to approach. Zagloba and Wołodyjowski sprang out first, and helping Kmita to descend, took him at once by the arms. "Give room," cried Zagloba. "Give room," repeated the Luda men. The people pushed back at once, so that in the middle of the crowd there was an open road along which the 2 knights led Kmita to the porch. He was very pale, but walked with head erect, at once confused and happy. Olenka leaned against the doorpost, and dropped her arms without control at her sides. But when he was near she looked into the face of the emaciated man, who after such a time of separation approached, like Lazarus, without a drop of blood in his face, then sobbing, rent her breast again. He, from weeping, from happiness, and from confusion, did not know himself what to say. "What, Olenka, what?" But she dropped suddenly to his knees. "Jędrek," cried she, "I am not worthy to kiss thy wounds." At that moment strength came back to the knight, he seized her from the ground like a feather, and pressed her to his bosom. One immense shout, from which the walls of the house trembled and the last of the leaves fell from the trees, dinned every ear. The Luda men began to fire from pistols, caps flew into the air. Around nothing was to be seen but faces carried away by joy, gleaming eyes, and open mouths shouting, "Vivat Kmita! Vivat Panna Bilovic! Vivat the young couple! Vivat 2 couples!" Roared Zagloba, but his voice was lost in the general storm. Vodokty was turned as it were into a camp. All day they were slaughtering oxen and sheep at command of the sword-bearer, and digging out of the ground barrels of mead and beer. In the evening all sat down to a feast, the oldest and most noted in the rooms, the younger in the servants' hall. The simple people rejoiced equally at fires in the yard. At the chief table the cup went around in honor of 2 happy pairs. But when good feeling had reached the highest degree, Zagloba raised the following toast. "To thee I return, worthy Pan Andrei, and to the old friend, Pan Michael. It was not enough to expose your breasts, to shed blood, to cut down the enemy. Your work is not finished. For since a multitude of people have fallen in time of this terrible war, you must now give new inhabitants, new defenders to this commonwealth. For this I think you will not lack either in manhood or goodwill. Worthy gentlemen! To the honor of those coming generations. May God bless them, and permit them to guard this legacy which we leave them, restored by our toil, by our sweat, by our blood. When grievous times come, let them remember us and never despair, considering that there are no straits out of which it is impossible to rise, with united forces and the help of God." Pan Andrei not long after his marriage served in a new war which broke out on the eastern side of the Commonwealth. But the thundering victory of Charniecki and Sapieha over Hovanski and Dolgoruki, and the hetmans of the kingdom over Sheremetyev, soon brought it to an end. Then Kmita returned, covered with fresh glory, and settled down permanently in Vodokty. After him his cousin Yakub became banneret of Orsha, Yakub, who afterward belonged to the unfortunate confederation of the army. But Pan Andrei, standing soul and heart with the king, rewarded with the starostaship of Upita, lived long in exemplary harmony and love with Luda, surrounded by universal respect. His ill-wishers, for who has them not, said, it is true, that he listened overmuch to his wife in everything. He was not ashamed of that, however, but acknowledged himself that in every important affair he sought her advice.